The room is cast in a low, amber twilight, illuminated only by the dying embers of a hearth that has long ceased to crackle. Outside, the world moves with the indifferent rhythm of a mechanical clock, but within these four walls, the air is thick, stagnant, and heavy with an invisible gravity. A man sits at a heavy oak desk. His hands are unburdened by physical chains. His wrists bear no iron cuffs. His torso is free from any visible weight. By every measure of material reality, he is entirely unconfined. He has a full capacity of breath, an open doorway behind him, and an entire life stretching out into the dark horizon of the future. Yet he is stooped. His shoulders are rounded as though carrying a massive boulder carved from granite. His eyes are fixed not on the room, nor on the blank paper before him, but on a void suspended 2 inches above the desk. His jaw is clenched, locked in a silent, exhausting dialogue with a phantom. To the wise, invisible observer, the spectacle is both tragic and deeply paradoxical. If one were to search this room with the finest instruments of science, one would find nothing but wood, wool, skin, and bone. There is no enemy present. There is no weapon pressed against his throat. Yet the man is bleeding internally. He is enduring a psychological laceration so acute that his pulse races, his palms sweat, and his mind fractures into a state of panic. The source of his torment is a collection of spoken words, a critical dismissal from an authority figure, a cold rejection from a loved one, a sudden public failure that occurred over a decade ago. The people who uttered those words have long since moved on. Some have vanished from the earth, and the physical spaces where those scenes played out have been demolished, rebuilt, or altered beyond recognition. The year 2018 is as physically distant from this present moment as the ancient sands of Mesopotamia. Yet, here he sits, an advanced biological organism, completely paralyzed by an echo. Let the depth of this paradox be fully weighed. Where is yesterday? If a traveler wished to journey to the previous day, what vessel would they board? What coordinates would they enter into a navigational system? Is yesterday preserved somewhere in the cold vacuum of space, operating on a parallel frequency where past events continue to unfold like an unspooling film reel? Is it hidden behind the drywall of the room? Is it stored within the cells of the body as a permanent physical mass? The absolute, unvarnished truth is this: yesterday is nowhere. It has no latitude, no longitude, no atomic weight, and no permanence in the physical universe. It does not exist. It is an absolute blank space. And yet, this non-entity, this phantom archive, is the hidden hand that guides the stride of the living. It is the invisible architect of the human prison. Men and women walk through the bright open landscapes of their present lives, completely blinded by a shadow cast by a sun that set years ago. They carry ancient conversations, long-dead humiliations, and historical shames as though they are active, physical realities currently unfolding in the room. They are living under the total, unyielding dictatorship of something that does not exist. To understand how the human consciousness becomes a voluntary captive to a non-existent past, one must perform a rigorous philosophical autopsy on the belief systems handed down since childhood. From the earliest stages of development, the human mind is conditioned to accept a specific self-evident doctrine: the past is fixed. What happened, happened. History is a monument carved in stone, immovable, permanent, and real. This belief is treated not as a theory, but as the bedrock of realism. To suggest otherwise is often dismissed as a delusion, a psychological flight from facts, or a lack of personal integrity. Society demands that an individual acknowledge their history as a permanent ledger, a fixed account of rejections, failures, traumas, and limitations that forms the true foundation of who they are today. But let us deploy the method of recursive thinking to peer beneath this cultural dogma. We must ask the fundamental question: why does the past feel so solid if it has no physical location? The answer lies in a profound optical illusion of the human intellect. The past feels real not because it exists independently in some cosmic archive, but because the mind is continuously performing an act of active production in the present moment, misinterpreting its own current output as a historical record. Consider what a memory actually is. When an individual claims to remember an event that occurred 5 years ago, they believe they are opening a drawer in a mental filing cabinet and retrieving a static, pristine recording of an objective truth. This is a monumental error. Neurologically and metaphysically, there is no filing cabinet, there is no pre-recorded tape. When you remember, you are not traveling back in time. You are imagining right now, in this immediate present moment. The mind takes scattered fragments of sensory data, colors them with the current emotional state, and constructs a brand new mental representation. How does this construction occur? It occurs through the lens of the individual's present identity. If a person feels unworthy today, their mind will scan the dark waters of their inner landscape, select only those historical fragments that confirm unworthiness, piece them together into a high-definition mental movie, and project it onto the screen of current awareness. The individual looks at this movie and says, "See, this is who I am, because this is what happened to me." They fail to realize that the movie is being actively filmed, edited, and scored in the present tense. The memory is not an old monument, it is a live transmission. It is an imaginative act occurring now, under the exact same laws of consciousness that govern a deliberate visualization of the future. This realization shatters the foundational wall of the prison. If remembering is an act of imagining, then what memory creates is entirely subject to the laws of the imagination. There is no structural difference between imagining a future success and imagining a past failure. Both are current movements of consciousness. The tragedy of the human condition is that people use their imaginative power to build magnificent castles of limitation out of the raw material of their past, all while believing they are merely being realistic. They assume their history is an anchor dropped into solid rock, when in truth, they are the ones holding the chain, standing on a deck, willfully refusing to let go of an anchor that is hanging in an empty abyss. In the golden age of maritime exploration, there lived a legendary navigator named Captain Alistair Vance. He was a man of immense intellect, trained in the highest schools of mathematics, astronomy, and naval engineering. His vessel, the Sovereign, was a masterpiece of shipbuilding, outfitted with the strongest oak, the most resilient sails, and the most advanced brass astrolabes of the era. No expense had been spared to ensure that the Sovereign could traverse any ocean and conquer any storm. Vance had been commissioned by the Crown to map an uncharted, lucrative trade route through a dangerous archipelago known as the Sunken Teeth. Decades prior, a primitive merchant vessel had attempted this passage and met with disaster. The lone survivor of that expedition, a maddened, traumatized first mate, had scribbled a crude, frantic map before he died. This map, faded, ink-stained, and distorted by fear, showed the archipelago littered with jagged reefs, hidden sandbars, and a catastrophic whirlpool that allegedly swallowed any ship that dared approach. This map was handed to Captain Vance as his absolute guide. On a day blessed with crystal clear skies and a perfect, favorable wind, the Sovereign approached the outer rim of the Sunken Teeth. The water below was a deep, translucent sapphire blue. Lookouts stationed high in the rigging swept the horizon with telescopes, shouting down that the waters ahead were wide, deep, and entirely clear of obstructions. The instruments confirmed that the seafloor was hundreds of fathoms below the keel. There was no sign of churning foam, no shadow of hidden rock, no turbulence indicating a whirlpool. Yet, Captain Vance did not look at the sea. He did not look at the sky. His eyes were locked onto the faded, crumbling map pinned to his chart table. Suddenly, Vance screamed an order to turn the wheel violently to the port side. "Reef ahead!" he shouted, his face pale with a terror that belonged to another time. The crew, trained to obey without question, threw their weight into the helm. The Sovereign groaned as she turned sharply against her own momentum. The sudden, unnecessary maneuver caused the sails to snap violently, ripping the canvas against the rigging. The ship lost its speed and drifted aimlessly into a narrow, genuine rocky channel near the shoreline, a hazard that had not been there in the open ocean. An hour later, Vance spotted another note on the old map warning of the phantom whirlpool. Once again, ignoring the calm, undisturbed water before him, he ordered the anchor to be dropped instantly while the ship was still under full sail. The sheer force of the abrupt stop snapped the massive iron chain. The anchor, the ship's primary defense against real currents, was lost forever to the deep. The Sovereign now lay crippled, its sails torn, its anchor gone, marooned in a dangerous shallow bay, surrounded by actual rocks that the crew could now see. Captain Vance stood on the quarterdeck, weeping in despair, pointing at his dry, ink-stained chart. "You see," he cried to his officers. "The map warned us. The sunken teeth are unpassable. We were doomed from the beginning by the geography of this place." He could not see that the sea he was navigating was completely clear. He was not crashing into real reefs. He was crashing into the ink lines of a dead man's memory. He had used the magnificent power of the Sovereign to manifest the exact destruction he was trying to avoid, turning a flawless voyage into a shipwreck because he preferred the authority of an old blueprint over the reality of the open ocean. The story of Captain Vance is the story of every individual who allows their current life to be steered by the outdated charts of their past rejections and failures. The mind operates precisely like the Sovereign, navigating the wide, open potential of the present moment while violently reacting to phantom reefs that exist nowhere except on the dry paper of memory. To break this spell, one must learn to operate a new tool within the architecture of mind, the radio dial of attention. Imagine a radio receiver capable of tuning into thousands of different frequencies. If you tune the dial to a station broadcasting static weeping and tales of historical defeat, that is the melody that will fill the room. The room does not generate the music, the receiver does. Your consciousness is that receiver. The rejections, errors, and shames of your history are merely old frequencies. They have no power to broadcast themselves unless you willfully turn the dial of your attention to their channel and give them your current life force to play their tune. Today, the invitation is to perform an aggressive act of internal sovereign reclaim. When a memory of failure arises and attempts to dictate your choices, when it whispers that you cannot build the business, that you are unworthy of love, that you must contract and hide, you must halt the narrative mid-sentence. You must look at that memory not with fear, but with the cold, analytical gaze of a master investigator. Ask the phantom, "Where are you? Show me your location. Show me your physical reality outside of my current permission." When the intellect is forced to admit that the event has no physical presence in the room, that it is a completely empty space, the iron bars of the prison dissolve into smoke. You are no longer a victim of a historical event. You are the active author of a current imaginative act. You hold the pen, you choose the frequency. As we stand upon this newly cleared ground, realizing that the past is not a solid prison but a highly malleable shadow, a profound realization begins to stir within the awareness. If the past can be exposed as an illusion, what then of the future? If this initial architecture of freedom resonates with the deeper calling of your awakening mind, pause for a brief moment to subscribe to this broadcast and like this transmission, ensuring that these maps of liberation continue to expand across the collective consciousness. By recognizing that yesterday is nowhere, you have cleared the canvas of your life. The heavy stone monuments have been pulverized into raw, formless clay. But clearing the canvas is only the first phase of the master architect's work. One cannot leave a house empty, lest the old ghosts wander back into the vacant rooms. The question now shifts from a philosophical realization to an engineering directive. If memory is nothing more than a current act of imagination, how do we intentionally rewrite the code? How do we alter the transmission at its root? To answer this, we must step deeper into the laboratory of consciousness. We must move beyond the mere observation of the film projector and learn how to step into the projection booth itself. In the next chapter, we will dismantle the very mechanics of how a memory is manufactured, exposing the hidden machinery that allows us to take the raw clay of our history and reshape it into a monument of unshakable victory. Prepare to enter the architecture of remembrance. Deep within the subterranean heart of an ancient, forgotten metropolis lies a grand, vaulted theater. The air inside is cool and absolutely motionless, smelling of aged velvet, decayed paper, and brass polish. No living audience occupies the tiered rows of plush maroon seats. The balconies are empty, draped in cobwebs that shiver ever so slightly whenever a heavy carriage passes on the cobblestone streets far above. Yet, the theater is not dark. High in the rear projection booth, a lone, mechanical projector hums with a low rhythmic vibration. A brilliant beam of white light cuts through the darkness, illuminating millions of dancing dust motes as it arcs across the vast chasm of the room to strike a massive canvas screen. On that screen, a vivid narrative unfolds in high-definition color. A young child is being publicly chastised by an angry tutor. The colors are intense, the shadows are elongated and menacing, and the sound of the tutor's booming voice echoes off the empty walls with terrifying clarity. If an accidental traveler were to stumble into this theater, they would naturally assume they were watching a pristine, unedited historical artifact, a definitive live broadcast captured by an objective camera in a distant era. They would look at the screen, feel the secondary sting of the child's humiliation, and believe they were witnessing a fixed truth frozen in time. But if one climbs the narrow, iron spiral staircase to the projection booth, the illusion instantly shatters. There is no ancient, immutable film reel locked inside the machine. Instead, the projector is fitted with an intricate, hyper-complex apparatus of mirrors, prisms, and fluid dyes. The film strip itself is made of a strange, translucent substance that is constantly dissolving and reforming. As the strip passes before the intense burning heat of the projector's bulb, a hidden mechanism of tiny, silver mechanical arms actively splices new frames into the reel. Another mechanism injects deep hues of blue or red ink directly onto the surface of the slide, while a set of warped lenses distorts the edges of the images in real time. The movie playing on the screen is not being retrieved from a vault. It is being actively manufactured, altered, colored, and scored at the precise microsecond it passes in front of the light. The heat of the bulb, which is the light of current consciousness, is melting the old script even as it displays it. The past being projected onto the canvas of the present is not a record. It is a live, highly biased, continuous production. The paradox is absolute. The theatergoer weeps for an event they believe is set in stone, while completely oblivious to the fact that the machine is changing the stone into fluid with every single tick of the clock. To dismantle the psychological prison of the human condition, one must wage a relentless intellectual war against the concept of memory as a static, archival filing cabinet. The ordinary human being moves through life under the profound delusion that the brain is a biological recording device, a digital hard drive that takes an exact snapshot of an event, stores it in a specific neural drawer, and leaves it there untouched until it is needed for future reference. When they recall a betrayal from their youth, they believe they are traveling backward along a timeline, entering a cosmic archive, and viewing an unaltered document. Let us apply the scalpel of recursive thinking to this illusion. We must ask the first critical layer of inquiry. Why does a memory feel like an accurate, objective recording of history if it is actually a current construction? The mind experiences this deception because it possesses an evolutionary craving for narrative consistency. To function in a chaotic universe, the ego requires a stable identity, and a stable identity requires a seemingly unalterable origin story. Therefore, when the conscious mind demands to remember a past event, the subconscious mind acts as a highly efficient, invisible stage manager. It does not pull an intact film from a shelf. It pulls raw, scattered fragments of emotional energy, chemical residues, and conceptual data points out of the nervous system. It then rushes to assemble these chaotic fragments into a coherent, linear story. But how does this assembly take place? What is the organizing principle that decides how the fragments are pieced together? This is the hinge upon which the entire door of human destiny turns. The organizing principle of memory is not historical accuracy. It is the current emotional state of the individual at the exact moment of recollection. Memory is a slave to the present. It does not report the past. It translates the past to match the dictates of the current internal kingdom. If an individual occupies a state of lack, unworthiness, or fear in this immediate moment, that state acts as a highly specialized magnetic filter. When the mind looks back at a childhood event, the filter blocks out all fragments of warmth, resilience, or neutrality. It extracts only the fragments of coldness, neglect, and failure. The mind then takes those dark fragments, weaves them together with current anxieties, and presents a memory that perfectly justifies why the individual feels worthless today. Conversely, if the exact same individual shifts into a state of high creative authority and worth, and then recalls the exact same childhood event, the magnetic filter changes. The fragments of neglect recede into the shadows. The fragments of personal survival, hidden strength, and structural lessons come forward. The memory literally reorganizes its internal architecture. The life story transforms from a tragedy of victimization into an epic saga of preparation. Therefore, we arrive at a radical metaphysical law. Remembering is imagining. There is no structural, neurological, or energetic difference between an act of memory and an act of future visualization. Both are current movements of the imaginal faculty occurring now. When you remember a failure from 5 years ago, you are not visiting 5 years ago. You are performing a creative imaginal act at this exact second. And because it is an imaginal act happening in the present, it is fully bound by the supreme law of consciousness. What you imagine becomes what you experience. By continuously remembering limitation, you are not merely reviewing your history. You are actively using the creative power of your imagination to manifest that exact limitation into your current physical world. You are using a tool designed to build empires, to construct a deeper dungeon for your soul. In the cultural heart of Florence, during the twilight of the 19th century, there lived a master art conservator named Signor Marcello Rossi. He was renowned across the continent for his uncanny ability to restore ancient, damaged paintings to their former glory. Museums and princes sent him works that had been blackened by centuries of candle soot, torn by war, or rotted by moisture, trusting him to return them to the exact state intended by the original masters. One winter, Marcello received a truly extraordinary piece, a heavily degraded, canvas-backed portrait painted by an anonymous student of Leonardo da Vinci. The painting was titled The True Countenance of Isabella. It had spent 2 centuries in a damp, forgotten cathedral basement. When Marcello laid it upon his grand wooden easel, it was a disaster. More than 70% of the original paint had flaked away, leaving vast, jagged expanses of bare brown canvas. All that remained of the face were a fragment of a dark eye, a faint outline of a jawbone, and a hint of a crimson velvet robe. The original sketches, journals, and descriptions of Isabella had been burned in a historic fire. There was absolutely no blueprint left to follow. Marcello was tasked with a monumental challenge. He had to fill in the blank spaces. He had to restore the portrait to its historical truth, using only the tiny, broken fragments left behind. On the first week of the project, Marcello received devastating news. His life savings, invested in a shipping venture, had been completely lost at sea. He was facing bankruptcy, public ruin, and the eviction of his family from their ancestral home. A profound, suffocating cloud of melancholy and bitterness settled over his mind. His hands trembled as he mixed his pigments. He sat before the true countenance of Isabella and began to paint. He dipped his brushes into deep, somber tones of charcoal gray, olive green, and bruised violet. When he worked on the mouth, guided only by a tiny line of old paint, his own despair flowed unconsciously through his fingers. He drew the lips with a tight, subtle downward curve. He deepened the shadows beneath the eyes, making them appear hollow, exhausted, and haunted by betrayal. He altered the tilt of the head ever so slightly, giving the subject the posture of a woman utterly crushed by the cruelty of fate. When the work was finished, the directors of the museum gathered in his studio. They gasped in awe. "It is a masterpiece of psychological realism," they declared. "Look at the tragic weight she carries. One can see that Isabella was a woman born to suffer, a soul intimately acquainted with sorrow. You have captured her history perfectly, Marcello." Marcello nodded, believing he had simply uncovered the objective truth hidden within the canvas. 3 years passed. Through an unexpected inheritance and an explosion of international acclaim, Marcello's fortunes completely reversed. He became immensely wealthy, his family was secure, and his days were filled with a radiant, unshakable joy and peace. One evening, a wealthy patron purchased the true countenance of Isabella and brought it back to Marcello's studio, requesting that a minor scratch on the frame be repaired. As Marcello stood alone in the moonlight, looking at the painting he had completed during his darkest winter, a cold shock ran down his spine. He no longer saw psychological realism. He saw a horrific distortion. The painting did not look like an objective historical figure. It looked like a mirror of his own past misery. He realized with absolute clarity that the tragedy on the canvas had not been placed there by the Renaissance master. It had been placed there by his own brush, using his own temporary despair to fill in the blank spaces of history. Driven by a sudden divine fury, Marcello grabbed his palette. He did not scrape away the old canvas. He simply dipped his brush into warm tones of gold, amber, and vibrant rose. He painted directly over the shadows he had created 3 years prior. With precise, delicate strokes, he lifted the corners of Isabella's mouth into a soft, triumphant smile. He infused her eyes with a bright, intelligent spark of resilience and sovereign power. He softened the harsh, jagged outlines of her jaw with a warm, luminous glow. When the patron returned, he stared at the canvas in absolute bewilderment. "What have you done, Marcello?" he whispered. "This is a completely different woman. The entire history of her soul has changed." "No," Marcello replied softly, looking at his own radiant reflection in the varnish. "Her history did not change. The history was always a blank space. I have simply chosen a different palette to fill it in." The revelation of Signor Marcello is the exact key required to unlock the prison of human memory. Your past is not a finished painting hanging in a secure gallery. It is a heavily degraded canvas where the vast majority of the data has long since evaporated. You are not a passive observer of your history. You are the master restorer who sits before the easel every single day, choosing the pigments, mixing the oils, and deciding whether to fill in the blank spaces with the charcoal of old grievances or the gold of current sovereign power. To embody this truth today, one must implement the practice of the editorial audit. Whenever an old painful memory rises into your awareness and causes your chest to tighten, you must immediately refuse to treat it as a historical fact. You must view it as an active, unvarnished painting session occurring in the present moment. Interrupt the script. Step back from the easel of your mind and ask yourself this precise question. What color am I choosing to paint this scene with right now? Am I using the muddy inks of my current fears to make this past event look larger, darker, and more permanent than it ever actually was? Realize that the person who hurt you, the business that failed, or the mistake you made is merely a tiny 2-inch fragment of old paint on a massive canvas. The rest of the scene, the meaning of the event, the emotional weight it carries, the effect it has on your current identity is entirely being painted by your current state. You have the absolute, immediate authority to change the palette. You can consciously inject strength, understanding, and triumph into the empty spaces of that memory until the entire composition shifts from a record of defeat into a monument of mastery. As we lay down the restorer's brush, realizing that we are the active engineers of our own past, the ground beneath our feet begins to vibrate with a deeper, more urgent truth. For if memory is not a neutral record but a live creative force, then every single time we recall a limitation, we are sending a massive energetic shockwave into our present physical bodies and environments. We are broadcasting an invisible currency that the world must instantly mirror. The architecture of mind is grander and far more dangerous than we have been led to believe. We are not merely carrying memories. We are carrying highly active, explosive emotional payloads that act as a silent dictatorship over our daily reality. How does this silent dictatorship operate in the shadows of our careers, our relationships, and our financial structures? Why do our highest forward-facing intentions constantly shatter against the invisible walls of our backward glance? To discover the hidden mechanism of this sabotage, and to learn how to completely defuse the emotional bombs planted in our history, we must transition to the next phase of our journey. The morning market of a sprawling ancient citadel is a symphony of sensory opulence. Beneath a canopy of woven silks and sun-bleached linen, the air is thick with the sharp aroma of roasted cardamom, crushed coriander, and the sweet, heavy scent of overripe figs. Merchants dressed in robes of fine Damascus wool call out to the passing nobility, their voices competing with the metallic clink of silver coins and the rhythmic clip-clop of purebred horses on polished limestone. Through this sea of vibrant life walks a man of immense material fortune. His name is Lord Julian. His outer garments are a testament to absolute privilege, a tunic of deep indigo velvet bordered with intricate gold filigree, a cloak pinned at the shoulder by a flawless, unblemished emerald the size of a kestrel's egg. By every outward metric, his presence should command immediate reverence, warmth, and the obsequious favor of every vendor in the square. Yet, as Julian approaches, a subtle, inexplicable shift ripples through the crowd. It is not a visible disturbance, but a psychological chill that precedes his stride like a low-hanging fog. The boisterous fruit sellers instinctively lower their voices, their smiles freezing into rigid, formal masks. The flower girls step back from the edge of their stalls, pulling their baskets inward without consciously knowing why. The wealthy spice traders, who would normally rush to greet a man of his stature, suddenly find themselves preoccupied with checking the seams of their sacks. Julian does not speak an unkind word. His posture is erect, and his coin purse is conspicuously heavy at his hip. Yet he radiates a persistent, invisible frequency that smells faintly of rot, desolation, and impending ruin. To the wise, invisible observer, the mystery of Julian's social exile is immediately transparent. He is wealthy in the physical currency of the empire, but his internal atmosphere is completely bankrupt. Beneath the indigo velvet and the gold thread, his consciousness is entirely submerged in the freezing waters of a childhood eviction that occurred 40 years ago. When he looks at a merchant, his eyes do not see the present individual. They see the sneering faces of the bailiffs who threw his family's meager belongings into the mud when he was a boy of 6. He is walking through a sunlit paradise of abundance, yet he is carrying the heavy, toxic payload of ancient poverty in his chest. He believes he is shopping for spices, but he is actually broadcasting a silent command of unworthiness to the environment. The marketplace is not reacting to his emerald pin. It is bowing to the silent dictatorship of his carried state. The paradox is profound. A king walks among merchants, yet his invisible atmosphere forces the world to treat him like a thief awaiting execution. To break the invisible chains that hold humanity in a state of perpetual frustration, we must perform a precise psychological dissection on the relationship between memory and emotional vibration. The fatal error of the average individual is the belief that memory is a neutral archive, a dry repository of data points that can be recalled to the mind without altering the baseline energy of the present body. They assume that thinking about an old betrayal or a past financial disaster is simply an intellectual exercise, an inert review of historical facts. Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to expose the dangerous falsity of this assumption. We must ask the first fundamental question: why does a recalled memory possess the power to instantly alter the physical and psychological reality of the present moment? The answer lies in the nonlinear nature of the subconscious mind. The deeper levels of human consciousness do not possess an internal clock. They do not recognize the difference between an event occurring out in the physical street and an event occurring purely within the theater of the imagination. To the nervous system, there is no timeline. There is only a perpetual now. Therefore, when you summon a memory of rejection from 5 years ago, you are not merely looking at a picture of rejection, you are actively regenerating the chemical, emotional, and psychological state of rejection within your current body. You are taking the energetic payload of that historical moment and injecting it directly into your present consciousness. We must then ask the secondary, deeper question: how does this carried state actively shape the external material reality of an individual's life? This is where the metaphor of the mirror must be fully understood. The material universe does not respond to your desires, your words, or your intellectual wishes. It responds exclusively to your state of being. Your state of being is the sum total of your dominant thoughts and feelings, the inner ground from which you speak, move, and breathe. It acts as an energetic radio tower, continuously broadcasting a specific frequency into the field of reality. When you carry the state of someone who was rejected, you are not a neutral observer of life. You are a highly active, creative force generating the frequency of rejection right now. This carried state subtly alters the micro-expressions of your face, the tone of your voice, the cadence of your stride, and the invisible signals you project during a conversation. It distorts your perception, causing you to interpret a neutral silence from a business partner as an insult, or a genuine compliment from a spouse as sarcasm. Because you are being a rejected person, you automatically seek out, create, and magnetize scenarios that validate that identity. You choose words that invite dismissal. You shy away from opportunities that require confidence. You project a subtle, defensive hostility that forces others to withdraw from you. The memory is not a harmless ghost. It is an active factory producing a specific energetic currency. If that currency is lack, failure, or humiliation, then the mirror of the world has no choice but to reflect that lack back to you in the form of ruined deals, fractured relationships, and persist stagnation. You cannot escape the harvest of the seed you are currently planting through the act of remembrance. The dictatorship is absolute because it operates from within the very throne room of your own attention. In the cultural zenith of Edwardian London, there lived a stage actor of unparalleled genius named Lawrence Vance. He was a man possessed of a magnificent, resonant voice, a commanding physical presence, and an analytical mind that could dissect the deepest currents of human psychology. His ability to inhabit a character was so absolute that when he stepped onto the stage, the audience forgot they were watching a performance. They believed they were looking at reality itself. His greatest triumph came when he was cast as King Lear in a radical, avant-garde production at the Royal Theatre. To prepare for the role of the betrayed, maddened monarch, Lawrence withdrew from society for 6 months. He studied the psychology of profound grief, isolated himself in a dark room, and meticulously constructed the internal state of a ruler who had been stripped of his crown, abandoned by his daughters, and left to howl against the storm on a barren heath. The production was an unprecedented masterpiece. Lawrence played the role for a record-breaking 10-year run, performing 6 nights a week. Every evening, for 3 hours, he forced his body and mind to generate the intense, toxic emotional payload of absolute betrayal, paranoia, and existential ruin. He wept genuine tears, his blood pressure soared, his chest contracted with the agonizing weight of a monarch who trusted blindly and lost everything. After a decade of glittering success, the production finally closed. The sets were dismantled, the velvet costumes were packed into trunks, and the theater itself was eventually demolished to make way for a modern Grand Avenue. Lawrence was a wealthy man, highly celebrated, and free to enjoy the remaining decades of his life in peace, but something terrible began to happen within the quiet sanctuary of his private home. Lawrence had stepped off the stage, but the stage had not stepped out of Lawrence. The curtain had fallen in the physical world, but within the subterranean architecture of his consciousness, the projector was still running the film of the betrayed king. Because he had rehearsed the state of betrayal thousands of times, it had become the permanent operating system of his mind. When he sat at the breakfast table with his devoted wife, his eyes, hollowed by years of performed paranoia, would look for signs of hidden deceit in her smile. If she spoke quietly to a servant, Lawrence's chest would instantly contract with the ancient, familiar panic of a monarch anticipating a palace coup. He began to accuse her of plotting to steal his wealth, his voice booming through the house with the theatrical thunder of King Lear. When his business partners presented him with highly lucrative, safe investments to preserve his fortune, Lawrence did not see a financial opportunity. He saw the treacherous advisors who had left him on the heath. He would scream insults at them, tearing up contracts and locking himself in his study, convinced that the entire city was engaged in a massive conspiracy to reduce him to a beggar. His friends gradually abandoned him, unable to endure the suffocating weight of his constant suspicion. His wife, broken-hearted by his inability to see her love, eventually removed herself to the countryside. Lawrence was left entirely alone in his vast, silent mansion. One stormy winter night, the invisible observer watched as Lawrence paced his library. The room was warm, the shelves were lined with leather-bound books, and his bank accounts were overflowing. Yet, he was dressed in tattered rags, his hair was wild, and his eyes were wide with a terror that belonged to a fictional script written a century prior. He stood before a grand, silvered mirror, shaking his fist at his own reflection. "Why have you forsaken me?" He howled into the empty room, his voice cracking against the thunder outside. "Where are my guards? Where is my kingdom?" He was not being haunted by an actual enemy. He was not being punished by fate. He was simply a man who had forgotten that the play was over. He was destroying his real, abundant life by continuing to carry the emotional payload of a dead script, forcing his world to become the very heath he had so masterfully imagined in the dark. The tragedy of Lawrence Vance is the silent tragedy of the vast majority of human lives. Men and women walk through the executive boardrooms, the romantic bedrooms, and the creative studios of their present lives, completely unaware that they are still wearing the heavy, tattered costumes of their old wounds. They are trying to build a future of abundance while broadcasting the precise emotional payload of their past bankruptcies. To break the power of this silent dictatorship, one must learn to practice the art of the somatic audit. Your body is the ultimate barometer of your carried states. It cannot lie. When you stand on the threshold of a new choice, when you are about to pitch a client, enter a new relationship, or speak your truth, you must pause and close your eyes. Turn your attention inward, away from the external world, and scan the landscape of your physical form. Where is the contraction? Is there a tightness in your throat, a dull weight in your chest, a sharp knot in your stomach? Realize that this physical contraction is not a response to the present moment. It is the energetic ghost of an old memory, a carried state of failure or rejection that has arisen from the shadows to hijack your future. Do not fight the contraction. Do not try to override it with frantic positive affirmations. Instead, use the power of your current sovereign attention to isolate the payload. Say to yourself, this weight is an old currency. It belongs to a play that has already closed. I am no longer obligated to perform this script. Before we trace the hidden currents that sabotage our highest intentions, take a quiet breath and acknowledge the profound mechanics of your own attention. If this realization strikes a chord within your developing awareness, consider subscribing to this chronicle and liking this broadcast to ensure these architectures of mind continue to reach those ready for transformation. By consciously separating your present identity from the carried state of the past, you strip the phantom of its authority. You rip the crown away from the dead king and place it back upon the true ruler of the present moment, your own conscious imagination. But recognizing the payload is only half the battle, for there is a deeper, more insidious paradox that must be confronted. Even when an individual understands that they are carrying these old states, they often find themselves trapped in a strange, exhausting cycle of failure. They spend their nights visualizing wealth, health, and joy, yet their days remain stubbornly unchanged. Why does a deliberate one-hour visualization of the future so often shatter into pieces against the weight of our daily lives? What is the hidden anchor that continuously pulls the ship backward into the mud, no matter how hard we rev the engine? To discover the definitive law that governs this metaphysical tug of war, and to learn how to sever the anchor chain once and for all, we must advance to the next level of the blueprint. The harbor at dawn is a canvas of cold slate grays and pale milky whites. A dense, low-hanging mist clings to the surface of the black water, swallowing the hulls of the moored fishing vessels and turning the distant lighthouse into a faint, pulsing smudge of amber light. At the end of the long stone pier sits a marvel of modern naval engineering, a high-performance racing speedboat named the Horizon King. Her hull is a sleek, aerodynamic blade of carbon fiber and polished steel. Her twin turbines are capable of unleashing the raw, explosive power of 3,000 horses. The captain steps onto the deck. He is a man of singular focus, obsessed with the conquest of speed and distance. He places his hand upon the leather-wrapped throttle and pushes it forward with a smooth, deliberate motion. Instantly, the mechanical beast roars to life. The twin turbines scream, a high-pitched, deafening wail that shatters the morning silence. The water behind the stern turns into a violent, churning cauldron of white foam and boiling spray. The hull vibrates with immense, terrifying kinetic energy. The bow lifts out of the water, tilting toward the open ocean like an arrow pointed at the stars. By every law of visible mechanics, this vessel should shoot across the harbor like a bolt of lightning, tearing through the mist and claiming the horizon. Yet, the Horizon King does not advance a single inch. The hull strains, rocking violently from side to side. The engines burn through gallons of high-grade fuel, casting a thick, acrid cloud of blue smoke into the air. The water is whipped into a frenzy of foam. But the boat remains locked in place, fixed to its coordinate as though frozen in a block of ice. The captain increases the throttle to maximum capacity. The temperature gauges spike into the dangerous crimson zone, and the metal hull groans under the stress of its own unspent momentum. Still, there is no forward progress. To the wise, invisible observer, the absurdity of the spectacle requires no complex diagnosis. One does not need to look at the engine, nor the fuel lines, nor the design of the hull to understand this paralysis. One simply needs to peer beneath the surface of the churning water. There, buried deep in the black, prehistoric mud of the harbor floor, lies a massive 10-ton iron anchor. From its heavy flukes, a thick, rusted chain stretches upward through the dark water, passing through the hawse-pipe of the ship, bolted directly to the structural keel. The captain has spent months polishing the deck, upgrading the turbines, and steering his vision toward the open sea. But he has forgotten to lift the iron link that binds his vessel to the mud of the harbor. He is attempting to conquer the future with the throttle of his desire, while remaining completely anchored to the bottom of the world by the weight of his unexamined past. This mechanical gridlock is the perfect metaphysical diagnostic for the modern spiritual dilemma. Millions of sincere, deeply committed individuals spend their lives trapped in an exhausting, demoralizing cycle of self-induced frustration. They read the great texts of consciousness, attend the masterclasses, and sit in silent meditation every evening. For one disciplined hour before sleep, they close their eyes and perform magnificent acts of forward visualization. They picture a reality of immense financial abundance, vibrant physical health, and profound creative freedom. They feel the joy of the win. They manifest the mental blueprint of a brilliant future. Yet, when they wake the next morning and step into the material world, they find themselves trapped in the exact same financial reality, the same stagnant relationships, and the same suffocating professional limitations week after week, year after year. Let us deploy the method of recursive thinking to expose the hidden law that governs this failure. We must ask the fundamental question: why does a powerful, deliberate one-hour visualization of a new future consistently fail to alter the experienced reality of an individual? The failure occurs because of a massive, unexamined disparity in the economy of human attention. The human mind does not stop creating when the formal hour of visualization ends. The imaginal faculty is a perpetual motion machine. It runs 24 hours a day, 365 days a year, operating continuously beneath the surface of conscious awareness. When the individual completes their one-hour ritual of forward visualization, they believe they have done the work of creation. But what happens during the remaining 15 or 16 waking hours of their day? As they drive to work, pay their bills, and interact with colleagues, they do not remain in the frequency of the new future. Instead, they automatically turn the radio dial of their attention back to their habitual baseline. They slip into the ordinary mechanical act of daily remembrance. They unconsciously rehearse the memory of the client who dismissed them last week. They replay the childhood narrative that money is scarce and difficult to retain. They ruminate on the long accumulated weight of things not working out. We must then ask the secondary, deeper question: how does this backward remembrance completely neutralize the forward visualization? It is a simple matter of structural weight and mathematical volume. If you spend 1 hour painting a mental picture of wealth, but spend 15 hours walking through the world being the person who has never had enough, the 15 hours will always dictate the harvest of your reality. The memory of lack is not a passive historical file. It is a highly active, continuous imaginal act. Every time you remember a past failure with a sigh of resignation, you are generating the state of failure in your present consciousness with a consistency and force that the fragile, newly introduced visualization cannot overcome. You are trying to row a boat forward using a tiny, decorative plastic paddle of positive thinking, while a massive, automated industrial winch is continuously pulling the ship backward via the iron cable of your memories. The subconscious mind is completely indifferent to whether an imaginal act is oriented toward the future or the past. It simply responds to the weight of the dominant assumption. If your memories are heavier than your visions, if your history feels more real to you than your destiny, then the mirror of reality must continue to project the old landscape forward. You cannot build a monument of glass and gold upon a foundation that you are actively dismantling every hour through the dark ritual of backward remembrance. In the opulent heart of the ancient city of Alexandria, there lived a master builder named Master Nicholas. He was a man of vast architectural genius, revered for his ability to transform raw stone and timber into monuments of breathtaking beauty. The emperor had commissioned Nicholas to construct a magnificent, modern lighthouse on the edge of the northern harbor, a towering structure of white marble, glass, and polished bronze that would guide ships from the furthest reaches of the known world. Nicholas spent months in his drafting room, illuminated by the light of a dozen oil lamps. He created a flawless blueprint for the tower. It was designed with a wide, innovative volcanic ash concrete foundation, reinforced with iron bars, engineered to withstand the most violent seismic shifts and the most ferocious oceanic storms. Every line was drawn with absolute mathematical precision. Every calculation promised a monument that would endure for 1,000 years. The construction began. Every morning, Nicholas stood on the cliffs, shouting orders to hundreds of stonemasons, engineers, and laborers. He watched as the massive blocks of pristine white marble were hoisted into place. He felt a deep, swelling pride as the first tier of the tower rose against the blue sky, exactly as he had envisioned it in his blueprints. Yet, a bizarre and terrifying phenomenon began to plague the construction site. Every morning, when Nicholas returned to the cliffs at dawn, he found that the previous day's progress had completely vanished. The pristine white marble blocks had not been stolen. They had been physically dragged downward, rearranged, and compressed into the shape of a cramped, dark, circular mudhud, the exact replica of the primitive, rotted shelter Nicholas had lived in during his childhood as a low-born slave. The foundation had shifted, the iron reinforcements had bent, and the ground was choked with the foul-smelling mud of his past. Nicholas was driven to the brink of madness. He doubled the guards at night, but they reported seeing no saboteurs, hearing no machinery. The stone seemed to move of its own accord, sliding backward into the earth as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon. Determined to catch the enemy, Nicholas hid himself within a cleft of the rock as darkness fell. The moon was a sliver of silver in the black sky. For hours the sight was silent, but at the stroke of midnight, Nicholas heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was the heavy, rhythmic clatter of iron tools. He crept out of the shadows and gasped in horror. The saboteur was not a rival builder, nor an enemy spy. It was his own head mason, a man named Thomas, who had been Nicholas's closest companion since their days in the slave quarters. Thomas was walking through the site in a state of deep, mechanical somnambulism, his eyes wide and vacant, unseeing. In his calloused hands, Thomas held a crumpled, filth-stained parchment. It was the original primitive blueprint of the old slave hut they had inhabited decades ago. With terrifying efficiency, Thomas was using a massive iron crowbar to tear down the marble blocks of the new lighthouse, systematically reshaping the foundation to match the old blueprint. Nicholas rushed forward and grabbed Thomas by the shoulders, shaking him violently. "Thomas, what are you doing?" Nicholas screamed. "Look at what you are destroying. We are building a lighthouse for the emperor. Why are you bringing back the hut?" Thomas blinked, his eyes slowly focusing as he woke from his trance. He looked down at the mud, then at the ruined marble, and finally at the old parchment in his hands. A profound, ancient sorrow filled his face. "Forgive me, master," Thomas whispered, his voice trembling with a weight that broke Nicholas's heart. "I see the marble during the day, and I hear your grand words. But when the night comes and the world goes dark, my mind cannot believe in the lighthouse. The lighthouse feels like a dangerous illusion that will bring the whip of the masters down upon us. This mud hut is the only thing that feels safe, the only thing that feels real. I do not want to destroy your tower, Nicholas, but my hands only know how to build what my memory cannot forget. The confession of the head mason is the silent confession of the human subconscious. The conscious mind desires to erect a magnificent lighthouse of wealth, health, and freedom. It brings the grand blueprints of visualization to the site during the day. But the subconscious mind is a mechanical builder that operates in the darkness of our habitual thoughts. If its deepest, most familiar blueprint is an old memory of lack, betrayal, or slavery, it will quietly and systematically tear down the marble of your visualizations while you sleep, returning your life to the safe, predictable shape of your past limitations. Therefore, we must issue a radical mandate for historical cleansing. Forward movement is an absolute mathematical impossibility, so long as the subterranean anchor remains hooked into the mud of your history. You must realize that you cannot create a new future until you have actively, deliberately dealt with the old blueprint that is running in the shadows of your daily attention. To embody this truth today, you must implement the practice of the anchor severance. You must stop treating your forward visualizations as a magical spell that will automatically erase your past. Instead, you must shift your focus toward the backward glance. Identify the specific memory that acts as your private mud hut, the historical event that makes your current visualizations feel like an unsustainable lie. It may be the memory of a public humiliation, a devastating financial loss, or a persistent childhood narrative of unworthiness. Look directly at that iron chain. Do not try to pull against it with the engine of your will. Instead, apply the ultimate realization we have established. The anchor only exists because you are actively imagining it right now. The chain is made of nothing but your own current attention. As the sun sets on the horizons of your old understandings, allow yourself to rest in the authority of your own creative imagination. If these architectures of consciousness have offered you a map out of your invisible prisons, take a brief moment to like this transmission and subscribe to our ongoing work, aligning your journey with our future insights. The time has come to stop rowing against the tide. We must introduce an active engineering tool that does not merely resist the old blueprint, but completely rewrites its lines, a tool that alters the very past from which the subconscious operates. How do we perform this retroactive surgery without falling into the trap of self-delusion or spiritual bypassing? How did a man who lost everything to a brutal public bankruptcy use this exact mechanism to rewrite his history and construct an entirely new empire from a revised foundation? To see this law executed with absolute clinical precision, we must step into the theater of an actual transformation. The executive suite sits on the top floor of a towering glass monolith, suspended high above the glittering neon-veined grid of a sprawling modern metropolis. Inside, the design is an absolute testament to contemporary power and minimalist sophistication. Walls of smooth, charcoal travertine, floors of polished basalt that gleam like black ice, and vast, floor-to-ceiling windows that offer an uninterrupted view of the horizon. The air is perfectly conditioned, silent, and smelling subtly of expensive leather and distilled rainwater. At a massive desk hewn from a single slab of petrified wood sits a man of immense structural capability. His name is Arthur Pendleton. Before him lies a thick leather-bound contract. The documents are printed on heavy, cream-colored archive paper, their clauses detailing an agreement that would merge his current firm with a global syndicate, instantly securing his financial legacy, validating his life's work, and catapulting him into the stratosphere of the world's elite creators. The ink is rich. The fountain pen in his hand is balanced perfectly between his thumb and forefinger. The tip of the gold nib is poised exactly 2 millimeters above the dotted line. He has only to press down. He has only to glide the pen across the page. There are no competitors blocking the doorway. No regulatory commissions are threatening intervention. His legal team has checked every line and pronounced it flawless. Arthur stands on the absolute precipice of the ultimate win. Yet his hand is frozen. The gold nib trembles ever so slightly, casting a microscopic, jittering shadow onto the cream paper. A cold, sudden bead of sweat breaks across Arthur's forehead, rolling down his temple to ruin the starch of his collar. His eyes, usually sharp and penetrating, glaze over with an opaque film of profound internalized terror. The air in his lungs suddenly feels thick, like liquid lead, and his chest contracts into a tight, agonizing knot. To any external observer peering through the glass, it appears as though Arthur is experiencing a sudden, catastrophic physical ailment. But to the wise, invisible observer, the diagnosis reveals an entirely different order of reality. There is no biological failure occurring within Arthur's heart. There is no assassin in the shadow of the travertine pillars. Instead, the executive suite has been completely invaded by a non-physical entity, a ghost born from a scenario that ended nearly a decade ago. Arthur's eyes are no longer looking at the pristine contract or the city lights. His consciousness has been violently snatched backward along the timeline. He is currently standing in a crowded, humid courtroom in the winter of 2017. He is hearing the sharp, wooden crack of a judge's gavel. He is seeing the flashing cameras of journalists recording the public. humiliating collapse of his first major corporate venture. He is feeling the sickening sensation of watching his reputation, his confidence, and the respect of his peers dissolve into the mud of a public bankruptcy. The event was legally resolved years ago. The debts were liquidated. The old court files were archived in a digital vault. The people who jeered at him have long since forgotten his name. Yet, right now, in this exquisite sanctuary of success, the dead moment is more real to Arthur than the petrified wood beneath his palms. The memory has issued an automatic, sovereign decree. Remember what happened last time. If you reach for the monument, the floor will turn to glass. Arthur drops the pen, slides his chair back, and walks away from his fortune, completely paralyzed by a ghost that has no blood, no bones, and no location in the physical universe. To fully comprehend the structural mechanics of Arthur Pendleton's paralysis, one must perform a rigorous psychological dissection on the concept of the automatic internal contraction. The fatal error of classical therapeutic and self-help modalities is the belief that a human being can override these deep, somatic defense mechanisms through intellectual analysis, willpower, or the frantic overlaying of positive affirmations. They instruct the individual to be brave, to push through the fear, or to repeat to themselves that they are safe in the present moment. Let us deploy the method of recursive thinking to expose why these surface-level strategies consistently shatter against the wall of traumatic memory. We must ask the first structural question. Why does an old, long-resolved memory possess the power to trigger an immediate, involuntary physical contraction that overrides the logical desire for success? The contraction occurs because the mind, in its evolutionary baseline state, prioritizes psychological survival over creative expansion. When an individual experiences a profound trauma, such as a public failure, a devastating rejection, or an acute humiliation, the subconscious mind registers that event not as an isolated historical data point, but as an existential threat to the ego. It takes a high-definition, energetic snapshot of the entire scenario, the environment, the somatic sensations, the specific look on a critic's face. The subconscious then stores this snapshot not as a dead record, but as a live, highly calibrated proximity alarm. When the individual moves forward into a new chapter of life and approaches a scenario that bears even a superficial resemblance to the original wound, such as signing a major contract, entering a high-stakes partnership, or exposing their true capability to the world, the alarm system detonates. We must then ask the secondary, deeper question. How does this alarm system actively reshape the individual's current reality if they do not consciously want to fail? The mechanism operates through the total hijacking of the imaginal faculty. When the proximity alarm is triggered, the subconscious mind instantly pulls the old memory out of the darkness and projects it onto the screen of current awareness with immense energetic force. It doesn't matter that the individual is looking at a new contract in 2026. The mind forces them to see the collapse of 2017. This internal projection produces an immediate chemical and emotional payload. The body reacts to the mental movie by contracting. The throat tightens, the heart races, the perspective narrows. The individual is thrown into a state of acute psychological survival. From this contracted state, their perception becomes completely distorted. They look at a flawless business agreement and see hidden traps. They look at a supportive partner and anticipate betrayal. They interpret a minor, natural delay as a definitive sign of impending doom. The contraction forces them to withdraw, to hesitate, or to act with a subtle, defensive hostility that alienates their allies. They drop the pen, they delay the launch, they sabotage the negotiation. They believe they are making a rational, cautious choice to protect themselves, when in truth, they are merely acting as the mechanical puppets of a carried state. The memory has become their active creator. It has dictated their posture, controlled their biology, and forced them to execute an external reality that perfectly matches the limitation of their history. They are caught in a closed loop of consciousness. Their memory creates their state creates their choice, and their choice remanifests the very past they are running from. When Arthur Pendleton found the master content architect, he was a broken machine. He was operating at less than 10% of his true creative capacity, living a small, gray existence in a modest suburban office, entirely insulated from the high-stakes arenas where his genius belonged. He explained his dilemma with a clinical, detached despair. "I have the visions," he said, his voice flat. "I see the empires I want to build. But the moment I step onto the field, the room goes cold. The ghost of 2017 stands on the baseline, and my body refuses to move. I am a prisoner to what happened." The master content architect looked at him with an absolute, unblinking authority. "You are not a prisoner to what happened, Arthur. You are a prisoner to what you are imagining right now about what happened. Show me where 2017 is. Point to it in this room. Bring me a jar filled with the dust of that courtroom." Arthur stared at his hands. "I cannot. It is gone." "Then why do you treat it as the bedrock of your reality?" The architect replied. "The event itself has evaporated from the physical universe. The only place it lives, the only place it has a tongue to speak or a whip to strike you is within your own current imagination. And because it only lives in your imagination, you have the absolute sovereign right to change the script. You are not changing history. You are changing the current creative act of remembrance. We are going to perform retroactive surgery on your foundation." The process was implemented that very night, precisely at the threshold of sleep. The architect provided Arthur with a specific clinical protocol. Arthur was instructed to close his eyes and deliberately summon the memory of the bankruptcy, not to run from it, not to intellectualize it, but to isolate the specimen. He returned to the courtroom of 2017. He felt the cold sweat, heard the judge's gavel, saw the flashing cameras. He located the exact spatial presence of the memory within his mind. Then, the architect issued the directive for radical revision. "Do not let the scene play out according to the old script. You are the editor in the booth. Stop the film. Take a deep breath of current sovereign air and deliberately inject a new set of frames into the reel." Arthur began to practice. Night after night, as his analytical, conscious mind grew soft, he entered the theater of his imagination and forced the scene to go differently. He went back to the courtroom, but this time he did not see a failure. In his revised imagination, he watched the judge look down from the bench, smile warmly, and strike the gavel to announce that the firm had been completely exonerated, that the restructuring was an unprecedented triumph, and that Arthur's genius had been fully vindicated by the court. He imagined the journalists rushing forward not to record a scandal, but to interview a visionary maestro who had navigated a complex crisis with absolute brilliance. He saw his partners standing around him, clapping him on the back, their faces filled with profound respect and admiration. Most importantly, Arthur did not treat this as a cheap fantasy or a comforting wish. He disciplined his mind to experience it as a memory, as if this was the absolute, factual truth of what had occurred in 2017. He focused intensely on the sensory details. He heard the specific tone of the judge's congratulatory voice. He felt the solid, warm grip of his partner's hand. He allowed his physical chest to expand with the immense somatic wave of relief, triumph, and proven capability. He fell asleep every night completely drenched in that state, refusing to leave the theater until the revised movie felt more natural, more heavy, and more real than the ghost. For the first 2 weeks, the old script fought back. The intellect would whisper, "This is a lie. You are deluding yourself. The records say otherwise." But Arthur remained unyielding, remembering the law. The records only exist in the present as a thought, and a thought can always be revised. He repeated the process hundreds of times, building the density of the new memory through sheer, disciplined repetition. By the 4th week, a profound and beautiful shift occurred. When Arthur closed his eyes and called up the year 2017, the courtroom of failure no longer appeared. The automatic contraction did not happen. Instead, his mind instantly presented the scene of the corporate vindication. The emotional payload had completely inverted. The memory no longer caused him to contract, it made him expand. He felt like a man who had already conquered the valley, a leader who had proven his mettle in the fire and emerged undefeated. 2 months later, Arthur stood once again in a high-floor executive suite, looking at a multi-million-dollar merger contract that was even larger than the one he had abandoned. The pen was in his hand. The gold nib approached the paper. The old proximity alarm was silent. The ghost had vanished because its fuel had been replaced. From his revised inner ground, operating from the consciousness of an undefeated king, Arthur pressed the pen to the page and signed his name with a smooth, effortless, and unshakable stroke. The world, mirroring his new baseline, instantly locked the success into material form. The triumph of Arthur Pendleton proves that the ultimate leverage point of human destiny lies not in the manipulation of external conditions, but in the retroactive restructuring of our internal ground. You do not have to spend the rest of your life managing the scars of your history. You can systematically remove the scars by changing the creative act of remembrance that keeps them alive in the present moment. To embody this truth today, you must identify your private haunted suite. Find the specific arena of your current life where you experience an irrational, automatic contraction, the phone call you delay, the relationship dynamic where you immediately become defensive, the financial boundary you are terrified to cross. Recognize that this contraction is the clear, unmistakable signal that an old, unrevised memory is currently running the script of your life from the shadows. Do not curse the fear. Do not try to fight the contraction with brute force. Instead, take a page from Arthur's manual. Isolate the specific historical event that birthed the alarm, the original rejection, the specific conversation, the definitive failure. Admit that the event has no physical reality in your room today. Then prepare your tools. You are about to step into the operating theater of your own mind. As the night deepens and the world falls into a quiet hush, the boundaries of what you once believed to be unalterable history begin to soften. You are no longer a passive passenger on a linear timeline. You are the sovereign architect poised at the editor's desk. If this clinical exposure of the mind's hidden architecture has ignited the flame of true independence within your journey, take a brief moment to like this broadcast and subscribe to our ongoing manual, aligning your growth with our future revelations. The mandate is clear, and the blueprint has been proven in the fire. But a practical question remains for the intellect that craves precision. How do we execute this retroactive surgery step by step? What are the exact protocols, the specific metrics, and the precise laws of consciousness that ensure a revision sticks to the canvas of the subconscious mind? The time for theory is over. The time for absolute technical mastery has arrived. We must break down the manual of revision into its core, clinical operations, starting with the deep science of isolating and localizing the phantom within the laboratory of attention. The operating theater is an oasis of absolute, blinding clarity suspended within a world of ambient chaos. The walls are lined with pristine tiles of stark white porcelain, reflecting a light so intense that it banishes even the most microscopic hint of shadow. At the center of this sterile chamber stands a master surgeon. Her movements are characterized by a profound, almost liturgical deliberation. She wears no expression of panic, no hurried anxiety. Her breath is a slow, rhythmic tide that anchors her entire being to the immediate present tense. Suspended directly above the operating table is a massive, highly calibrated diagnostic lamp. Its multifaceted lenses do not scatter light indiscriminately across the room. Instead, they condense thousands of individual beams into a single needle-thin shaft of incandescent radiance. This concentrated beam pierces the air like a solid rod of glass, illuminating a hyper-specific 2-inch zone upon the patient's body. Within that narrow circle of light, everything becomes hyper-visible. The surgeon does not cut blindly into the flesh based on a vague, generalized assumption of illness. She does not guess at the coordinates of the affliction. With surgical precision, she uses the narrow light to isolate a single, microscopic foreign anomaly, a deep-seated node that has been silently leaching toxins into the entire vascular system, causing the patient to waste away from an invisible poison. To the wise, invisible observer, this clinical operation is a perfect manifestation of an immutable metaphysical law. The average human being treats their psychological suffering as a vast, cloudy, and unmanageable storm. They walk through their days complaining of a generalized sense of lack, a vague and heavy cloud of depression, or a non-specific anxiety that blankets their entire horizon like a thick gray smog. They cry out that nothing ever works out for me, or that life is inherently unfair, attempting to treat a localized infection by warring against the entire atmosphere. But the master architect of mind understands that there are no generalized storms within the kingdom of consciousness. Every massive cloud of current limitation is being actively generated by a highly specific, localized engine hidden in the shadows of memory. The smog is not an atmospheric given. It is the smoke rising from a specific individual fire. To heal the life, one must completely abandon the lazy habit of fighting the smoke. One must enter the operating theater of the soul, ignite the blinding light of focused awareness, and pin down the exact microscopic coordinates where the primary trauma is currently burning. Until the phantom is isolated from the generalized haze of daily anxiety, it remains entirely immune to transformation, ruling the destiny of the individual from its sanctuary of darkness. To transition from a passive victim of historical circumstance to an active engineer of reality, one must master the technical mechanics of the revision protocol. This is not a superficial exercise in positive thinking or an emotional indulgence in nostalgic reflection. It is a cold, clinical operation performed upon the raw data of consciousness. The process begins with step 1, the identification of the specimen. Let us deploy the method of recursive thinking to understand why this initial isolation is mathematically mandatory. We must ask the first structural question: why does the subconscious mind resist generalized healing attempts, requiring instead a highly specific, hyper-definition memory to initiate a true transformation? The subconscious mind operates entirely through the language of specific sensory architecture. It does not understand abstract concepts, intellectual theories, or generalized complaints. If an individual tells their mind, "I want to heal my relationship with money," the subconscious registers nothing but empty noise. It cannot process the abstraction of money or the generalization of relationship. The subconscious only understands, forms the specific shapes, sounds, colors, and somatic pressures that were recorded during a moment of high emotional impact. Therefore, when you complain of a generalized limitation, you are attempting to edit a movie by shouting at the screen. To actually change the film, you must locate the exact frame where the negative code was first spliced into the real. You must look past the cloudy, ambient anxiety of your present day and ruthlessly extract a specific, high-definition specimen of memory. How does one identify the correct specimen? One does so by scanning their history for a concrete event that produces an immediate, recognizable downward drop in their current internal state. It must be an event you can close your eyes and see with absolute sensory clarity. A specific sharp conversation with a business partner, a particular cold, dismissive glance from a parent, a definitive moment of public rejection, failure, or loss. If you close your eyes and summon the scene, and your chest instantly contracts, your breath shortens, and your state drops from sovereignty to survival, you have found the specimen. You have isolated the localized engine that is generating the smoke of your current limitations. Once the specimen has been extracted, the operator must immediately advance to step 2, the localization of the ghost. This step is deceptively simple, yet it represents the ultimate philosophical pivot point of the entire revision process. The operator must gaze directly at the isolated memory and ask the radical confrontational question: where does this event exist right now? At this exact microsecond. Let us apply recursive thinking to this second layer of the manual. Why must the mind be forced to locate the physical coordinates of a memory before it can be revised? The mind must do this to shatter the illusion of historical independence. The average individual carries their memories as though they are real, external monuments located somewhere behind them on a physical timeline. They treat the trauma as an independent entity that possesses its own objective existence, its own gravity, and its own right to exert force upon the present. By aggressively demanding to know the physical location of the memory, by forcing the intellect to search the current room, to look behind the curtains, to check the floorboards, to examine the space between their hands, the individual forces a catastrophic collision between illusion and truth. The mind is compelled by its own logical faculties to admit a radical, liberating reality. The event itself no longer exists anywhere in the physical universe. It has no atomic structure, no weight, and no permanence outside of the immediate, current act of imagination occurring now, in this present moment of awareness. Through this localization, the memory is stripped of its historical authority. It is brought down from its pedestal as an unalterable monument of fact and exposed for what it truly is, a fluid, live, imaginal act that is completely dependent on your current permission to exist. The ghost is caught, It has been dragged into the surgeon's light, and its survival now hangs entirely on the choice of the operator. In the high, wind-swept kingdom of the northern reaches, there existed a vast and prosperous province known as Eldoria. For generations, Eldoria had been celebrated for its fertile valleys and its thriving trade routes that cut through the high mountain passes. But over the course of a single decade, a strange and devastating blight fell upon the land. A thick, perpetual draught of freezing, foul-smelling air began to sweep through the central valley, withering the wheat fields, turning the orchards to ice, and driving the cattle to madness. The governor of the province hired the most expensive mercenaries, engineers, and scholars to combat the blight. They built massive stone walls across the valley to block the wind. They lit immense bonfires along the roads to warm the air. They sprayed costly perfumes into the sky to mask the odor of decay. Yet all their efforts were an expensive failure. The stone walls were collapsed by the sheer pressure of the gale. The bonfires were instantly snuffed out by the freezing draft. The perfumes dissolved into the stench of the smog. The province was slowly bleeding to death, its people packing their wagons to abandon the land. In despair, the governor summoned a legendary figure known only as the master cartographer. She was a woman of silent demeanor, carrying no weapons, no heavy machinery, and no grand theories. She carried only a single trunk filled with delicate, specialized measuring instruments, fine brass calipers, sensitive barometers, and rolls of thin, silken ribbons painted with vibrant scarlet dye. "We are being destroyed by a monstrous, all-encompassing storm," the governor lamented, waving his hand toward the gray, howling expanse outside the castle windows. "It blankets the entire province. You must find a way to map this tempest and help us build a wall large enough to contain it." The cartographer looked out at the fog and shook her head softly. "A storm that is everywhere is a storm that cannot be defeated," she said, her voice smooth and unhurried. "You cannot capture the wind by warring against the sky. We must find the specific crack where the draft is entering the house." The next morning, the cartographer set out into the valley alone. She did not build walls, nor did she curse the weather. Instead, she climbed to the highest ridge of the mountain pass, where the wind was most violent. She stood upon the frozen rock, opened her trunk, and tied a single scarlet ribbon to the tip of a long brass rod. As the howling gale struck the ribbon, it did not move randomly. The cartographer observed its vibrations with an absolute clinical focus. She noticed that amid the chaotic swirling of the ambient storm, there was a hyperspecific, high-frequency shudder that occurred within the ribbon every time it faced a precise northern coordinate. Ignoring the miles of gray fog around her, she followed that microscopic shudder. She tracked it down the jagged face of the cliff, moving past vast fields of ruined crops, until she reached the base of an ancient, abandoned stone tower that had been built by a forgotten warlord centuries ago. The tower was completely surrounded by the dense, foul-smelling smog. Inside, the roar of the wind was deafening. The cartographer did not attempt to clean the entire tower. She climbed down into the subterranean cellar, where the air was black and freezing. She lit a single tallow candle, casting a narrow, brilliant circle of yellow light upon the far wall. Using her scarlet ribbon, she moved it slowly across the ancient masonry. For an hour, the ribbon hung limp in the darkness. But suddenly, as she approached a small, unnoticeable seam between two massive granite blocks, the scarlet ribbon went rigid, vibrating with a high-pitched, whistling scream. There, hidden beneath centuries of moss and dirt, was a narrow, 2-inch crack in the foundation. The ancient mortar had rotted away, exposing a direct, hyper-pressurized fissure that connected the cellar to a deep, subterranean volcanic chasm of ice and sulfur far below. The cartographer smiled. She had isolated the specimen. She had localized the ghost. This tiny 2-inch crack was the sole engine that was generating the entire miles-wide storm that was destroying Eldoria. The massive gale in the valley was not an unalterable given of nature. It was merely the amplified echo of this single localized point of failure. She reached into her trunk, pulled out a small trowel and a jar of dense volcanic ash cement, and packed the mortar tightly into the narrow seam, sealing it completely. Within an hour, the howling in the cellar ceased. By the next morning, the perpetual draft in the valley had vanished. The sun broke through the gray smog for the first time in 10 years, and the people of Eldoria woke to an open, radiant sky, all because a master had refused to fight the storm, choosing instead to find the coordinate where the wind was born. The victory of the master cartographer is the precise technical blueprint for the execution of the revision manual. The generalized anxieties, financial struggles, and relational patterns that plague your current days are not cosmic weather patterns that you must passively endure. They are the ambient smoke rising from a specific localized crack in the foundation of your memory. To change your life, you must stop attempting to spray the perfume of positive thinking onto the fog of your daily reality. You must find the crack. To body this truth today, you must enter the laboratory of your own mind and perform the sovereign isolation protocol. Sit in a quiet room, away from all external noise, and close your eyes. Allow the ambient chaos of your daily worries to settle into the background. Now deliberately bring before your inner sight a specific, high-definition memory of limitation, the exact conversation where you were dismissed, the precise moment where your venture collapsed, the specific face of the person who betrayed you. This is step 1. You have isolated the specimen. Now, execute step 2. While looking at that vivid mental movie, fiercely interrogate its geography. Ask yourself, where is this scene right now? Is it in the room? Is it behind my eyes? Can anyone else see it? Force your awareness to feel the absolute structural truth that the original physical event is completely gone. What you are holding is not a solid stone monument. It is a live, current, and fluid imaginal act taking place inside your own consciousness at this exact microsecond. You are the one generating the wind that is freezing your valley. As the mind awakens to the realization that it is the active landlord of an empty house, that the ghosts terrorizing its halls possess no independent authority outside of its own current attention, a profound sense of absolute leverage begins to settle within the soul. If the past has no physical location, then it has no logical defense against the intervention of the present. If this clinical dissection of the mind's internal mechanics has handed you the keys to your invisible cage, take a brief moment to like this chronicle and subscribe to our ongoing work, aligning your journey with our future insights. The specimen has been successfully dragged into the light, its coordinates have been locked down, and its illusion of historical permanence has been shattered into pieces. The foundation has been exposed for what it truly is, a collection of fluid, highly editable lines of code running in the current imagination. But isolation is merely the preparation for the true work of alchemy. One does not simply look at a crack in the stone. One must inject a new substance into the seam to alter the architecture forever. How do we perform the cinematic rewrite of the isolated frame? How do we build the sensory weight of the new script until it completely crushes the old trauma under the pressure of its own naturalness? And how do we read the somatic barometer to know with absolute certainty that the past has been permanently altered? To master the active, creative mechanics of the splice, we must step into the deep alchemy of the manual. The laboratory is buried deep within the thick stone foundations of an ancient academy, far below the reach of the noon sun or the ambient chatter of the town square. It is a space defined by a solemn, monastic silence, smelling of sulfur, distilled alcohol, and pulverized minerals. Rows of delicate glass alembics, spiraling copper tubes, and heavy iron scales line the dark cedar benches. At the center of the room stands a massive stone furnace, its hearth glowing with a steady, intensely focused white-hot flame that casts long, fluid shadows across the vaulted ceiling. Before this furnace stands the alchemist. His face is a mask of serene, unblinking concentration as he looks down into a heavy granite mortar. Resting within the stone bowl is a dark, heavy, and jagged lump of lead. To the uninitiated eye, this dull gray mass appears to be an unalterable given of nature, a dense, stubborn, elemental substance that possesses a fixed weight, a fixed density, and an absolute resistance to change. An ordinary man wishing to mask its unpleasant nature would merely apply a thin layer of gold leaf or paint to its surface, leaving the core untouched, cold, and heavy underneath. But the alchemist does not engage in the superficial deception of cosmetics. He does not try to decorate the lead or pretend it is something else. With a smooth, deliberate motion, he uses a pair of long iron tongs to lift the lead mass and drop it directly into a glowing ceramic crucible resting in the heart of the furnace. As the intense white-hot heat wraps around the bowl, the unyielding stone-like metal begins to experience a profound structural crisis. The rigid, frozen matrix of the lead begins to soften, its jagged edges dissolving, losing its fixed form until it liquefies into a dark, swirling pool of pure potential. The alchemist then reaches for a small vial containing a highly refined, luminous white powder, an elemental transmuting agent. He does not scatter it carelessly. He drops a single, precise grain into the center of the liquid pool. Instantly, a silent, molecular revolution detonates within the crucible. The dark fluid does not mask itself. It begins to alter its atomic frequency from the inside out. A radiant golden iridescence ripples across the surface of the liquid, purging the density, the coldness, and the heavy baseline of the lead until the entire substance shines with a brand new, unblemished nature. To the wise, invisible observer, this laboratory operation is the ultimate physical demonstration of the highest psychological law. The average individual treats their traumatic memories like chunks of unyielding lead, attempting to overlay them with the cheap paint of positive thinking or the fragile varnish of intellectual forgiveness. They leave the heavy, toxic core of the trauma active in their nervous system while wondering why their life remains stagnant. The master architect of mind knows that to transform the past, one must not decorate it. One must plunge it into the fierce, concentrated heat of the present imagination until its fixed architectural lines melt into pure potential, allowing a brand new, golden script to be permanently spliced into the core of consciousness. To achieve absolute technical mastery over the human timeline, the operator must now execute the active, transformative phases of the manual. Step 3. The cinematic rewrite. Step 4. The law of persistent friction. And Step 5. The somatic barometer. Having isolated the specimen of memory and stripped it of its spatial independence in the preceding steps, the consciousness now stands before the fluid, melted code of its history, poised to rewrite the script. Let us apply the method of recursive thinking to peer into the precise mechanics of Step 3. We must ask the fundamental question: how does one perform a cinematic rewrite of a past event without falling into the trap of cheap fantasy, wishful thinking, or psychological denial? The distinction between a superficial fantasy and a true metaphysical revision lies entirely in the depth of sensory engagement. When an individual engages in a fantasy, they watch themselves on the screen of their mind as a detached spectator. They see the character winning from a distance, which merely reinforces the present state of not having the win. In a true revision, you do not watch yourself. You step directly inside the film frame. You look through the eyes of the revised self. You hear through the ears of the revised self. You inhabit the body of the person who received the ultimate validation. How is this executed on the old data? If the isolated memory was a devastating moment of public rejection, you return to that precise spatial scenario in your imagination. But as the scene opens, you deliberately splice a new sequence of frames into the reel. You do not hear the no, you hear the yes. You make the tone of the speaker's voice clear, rich, and filled with genuine recognition. You see the faces around you shift into expressions of profound respect. You must make the revised scene as specific, as detailed, and as heavy with sensory data as the original trauma. You must feel the texture of the chair beneath your thighs, see the dust motes dancing in the light of that imagined room, and breathe the air of that revised environment. You must let the scene play out with such intense clarity that your present nervous system is forced to generate the deep somatic wave of relief, victory, and honor. You are redefining the raw material of your past into alignment with the state you choose to occupy today. This leads us directly to the secondary, deeper layer of the manual. Step 4. The law of persistent friction. We must ask, why does the original traumatic memory initially resist the rewrite, and how does the operator overcome this historical inertia? The original memory feels solid, heavy, and factual because you have unconsciously rehearsed it thousands of times. Repetition is the industrial press that stamps an imaginal act into the density of an experienced fact. Every single time you remembered that old failure over the course of 5 or 10 years, you were adding another layer of iron varnish to its structure. Therefore, when you introduce the revised version, it encounters immediate friction from the established neural and energetic tracks of the brain. The intellect whispers, "This didn't happen. It is a lie." To overcome this friction, the operator must deploy the law of nightly persistence. You must repeat the revised scene night after night, precisely at the twilight threshold of sleep, when the analytical filters of the brain are offline and the subconscious is completely porous. You must run the new film loop over and over, refusing to let your attention drift, until the repetition wears down the edges of the old trauma. You must persist until the revised version accumulates the exact same density, the exact same naturalness, and the exact same quality of course, that's what happened as the original memory. You are training the subconscious machine to accept a new baseline script. Finally, the operator must understand. Step 5, the somatic barometer. We must ask, how does the engineer know with absolute clinical certainty that the revision has taken root and altered the architecture of reality? The metric of success is never found by frantically scanning the external world for signs, messages, or immediate material changes. Seeking external confirmation is the hallmark of a state that does not yet possess the wealth. The true metric is found exclusively within your own body when you call up the memory. Before the revision, summoning that specific date or conversation caused your chest to contract, your throat to tighten, and your energy to drop into survival. When the revision has successfully settled into the subconscious as the dominant imagining, the barometer completely inverts. When you think of that past event, the contraction does not happen. Instead, your chest expands, your shoulders drop, your breath becomes long and deep, and you feel a profound, quiet sense of lightness and capability. The memory no longer drains your battery, it charges it. That shift in internal state is the absolute proof that the work is finished. The external mirror of the world has no choice but to adjust its alignment to match the new foundation. In the judicial capital of the old empire, there stood the great court of permanent record, a colossal structure of dark granite and cold iron, where the legal sentences of all citizens were carved into massive stone tablets. Once a sentence was handed down by the high magistrate, it was considered an unalterable truth, an immovable record that followed the condemned person through every hour of their life, determining what work they could perform, where they could live, and what rights they possessed within the state. There lived a young, brilliant merchant named Julian, who had been completely ruined by a historic decree of this court. 7 years prior, a treacherous competitor had forged a series of ledgers, framing Julian for a massive, fraudulent default against the imperial treasury. The high magistrate, viewing the forged documents, had pronounced Julian guilty of absolute financial bankruptcy and public deceit. The sentence was carved into the granite tablets. Julian was stripped of his merchant license, his properties were seized, and he was forced to live in the outer slums of the city wearing the grey tunic of a certified bankrupt. For 7 years, Julian attempted to rebuild his life. He studied new trades, visualized grand enterprises, and tried to present himself to new investors with confidence. But his efforts were entirely useless. Every time he entered a new bank or proposed a partnership, the clerks would open the great court's central registry, look at the carved stone tablet of 2019, and instantly throw him out of the office. The record of his past fraud was a permanent iron wall that neutralized his every forward-facing desire. In his hour of deepest despair, Julian was approached by a mysterious figure known across the empire as the Grand Litigator. He was a man who possessed a deep, mathematical understanding of the hidden laws of the judicial system. He carried no weapons, but his eyes held the quiet, unshakable authority of someone who had looked behind the curtains of power. "I have seen your struggles, Julian," the litigator said, his voice a low, resonant baritone. "You are trying to build a modern estate while leaving the central decree of your bankruptcy untouched in the halls of the great court. You believe you can move forward while the iron record is actively screaming that you are a thief. But the record is fixed," Julian cried, his chest contracting with the ancient, familiar shame of his sentence. "The stone is carved. The magistrate has spoken. I cannot change what happened in 2019. "The stone is not fixed," the litigator replied, a cold smile touching his lips. "The stone only has power because the guards look at it today and enforce it today. The past is not a sovereign country. It is a repository of documents maintained by the present court. If we can introduce a truer, heavier piece of evidence into the chamber, the entire sentence must dissolve as though it never existed. That night, under the cover of a dense autumn mist, the grand litigator led Julian into the cavernous archive room of the great court. The air was thick with the scent of old parchment and cold stone. Thousands of massive granite tablets lined the walls, each one holding the record of a citizen's permanent defeat. The litigator located Julian's tablet for the year 2019. There it was. The carved ink lines detailing the fraud, the default, and the public degradation of his name. The litigator did not bring a hammer to smash the stone. Instead, he pulled from his cloak a set of specialized legal instruments, a small, highly concentrated flask of acid, a collection of fine chisels, and a pristine royal imperial seal made of pure, heavy gold. "Now, Julian," the litigator whispered, pointing a narrow lantern beam at the stone, "you must step into the witness box of your own memory. You must not look at this forgery as a fact. You must look at it as a temporary draft that is awaiting the master's correction. Close your eyes and return to the courtroom of 2019. Julian closed his eyes and immediately felt the sickening contraction of his old shame. He saw the cold face of the magistrate, heard the jeers of the crowd. "Interrupt the film," the litigator commanded. "Force the scene to go according to the supreme law of justice. Look up at the bench. See the magistrate open a new, sealed envelope from the emperor himself. Hear his voice echo through the hall, announcing that the ledgers have been examined, that the forgery has been exposed, and that Julian is entirely innocent, pristine, and recognized as the most honorable merchant in the province." Julian breathed a deep, shuddering breath. He disciplined his mind to step inside the scene. He looked through his own eyes and saw the magistrate smile warmly at him. He heard the sharp wooden crack of the gavel announcing his absolute exoneration. He watched as the guards rushed forward to arrest his treacherous competitor. Most importantly, Julian did not treat this as a comforting daydream. He focused on the sensory density of the win until his physical chest expanded, his heart rate slowed, and a massive wave of golden, unshakable dignity flooded his entire body. As Julian held that state of absolute vindication in the darkness of the archive, the grand litigator worked upon the physical tablet with clinical precision. He applied the acid to the old carved words, dissolving the record of bankruptcy into a smooth blank surface. Then, with swift, masterful strokes of his chisel, he carved the new decree into the stone. Exonerated, proven innocent, crown merchant. He pressed the heavy gold imperial seal directly into the wet mortar at the base of the tablet, locking the new record into place. When the work was finished, Julian opened his eyes. He looked at the stone tablet. The old words were gone. The new script was carved deep into the granite, gleaming beneath the gold seal. The next morning, Julian walked into the largest financial house in the capital. He did not approach the desk with the hesitant posture of a bankrupt beggar. He walked with the long, easy stride of an unblemished leader who had been publicly honored by the crown. The chief clerk opened the central registry to check his record for the year 2019. The clerk's eyes widened as he read the granite entry, seeing the gold seal of the emperor. "Forgive our delays, Lord Julian," the clerk said, bowing low, his face filled with profound respect. "We see that your name was completely vindicated by the High Court. Your credit is unlimited. How may we serve your enterprise today?" Julian smiled softly, his posture remaining perfectly settled, light, and unshakable. He knew that the external world was merely reading the script he had boldly spliced into the stone during the dark hours of the night. The victory of Julian within the great court is the exact technical operation you are invited to perform upon the tablets of your own subconscious mind. Your past failures and traumas are not unalterable decrees carved into the fabric of reality. They are merely forged ledgers that you are actively allowing your current memory to present as truth. The time has come to walk into the archive room of your own soul, dissolve the old code, and press the gold seal of your current sovereign imagination directly into the stone of your history. To embody this truth today, you must execute the splicing ritual. Tonight, before you sleep, as your body relaxes into the mattress and your mind enters the soft, porous threshold of twilight, summon your isolated specimen of memory. Step directly inside the frame. Do not watch yourself. Be yourself within that coordinate. Now, perform the cinematic splice. Force the scene to go differently. If you were dismissed, hear the words of absolute acceptance. If you failed, feel the solid, somatic impact of the moment it worked. Make the images vivid, make the colors rich, and make the sounds crisp. Repeat this loop over and over, fighting the friction of the old script with the steady, unyielding pressure of your attention. Fall asleep in the precise state of the person who won that battle, letting your nervous system drench itself in the chemical payload of the new victory. Do not look for external signs tomorrow. Simply check your internal barometer. When thinking of that past event makes your chest expand with a light, easy confidence, know that the grand litigator has finished the work upon your stone. As the new code settles into the deep reservoirs of the subconscious mind, as the golden ink of the revised script begins to dry upon the canvas of your history, a strange and beautiful paradox begins to emerge within the awareness. For if we possess the sovereign authority to deliberately alter our memories through conscious discipline, we must confront a startling psychological law. Our present states have already been doing this work every hour of our lives without our awareness or permission. The mind is not a passive mirror. It is an active, ongoing editor that runs in the deep shadows below our waking thoughts. It is constantly rearranging our life stories to fit the temporary mood of our current day, building a cohesive case for either prison or paradise below the surface of our awareness. How does this permissionless editor operate behind the scenes of your daily life? How does a single childhood event transform into two completely different stories depending on the prism through which it is viewed? To understand this hidden mechanism of automatic self-authorship and to learn how to reclaim the editorial chair from the shadows, we must advance to the next level of the grand design. An alpine lake sits cradled within the jagged granite embrace of a colossal mountain range, suspended far above the frantic geography of the lowlands. The water is an immense primeval basin of fluid purity, deep enough to swallow an empire's fleet and silent enough to reflect the whisper of a passing hawk. There are no rivers churning its surface, no artificial dams altering its perimeter, and no external forces dumping sediment into its depths. By every physical measure, the contents of the basin remain absolutely identical from hour to hour, a fixed and unmoving mass of hydrogen and oxygen locked in the high altitude. Yet, as the eye of the wise, invisible observer watches from the cliffs, the lake refuses to remain the same. At the stroke of 7 in the morning, under a dark, bruised canopy of advancing storm clouds, the water appears thick, menacing, and ink-black. The shadows cast by the overhanging crags stretch across the surface like elongated, predatory fingers. The ripples look sharp, cold, and treacherous, conveying an unmistakable atmosphere of hidden danger and ancient desolation. A traveler standing on the shore at this hour would look into the depths, feel a shudder of instinctual dread run down their spine, and declare with absolute certainty that the lake is a crucible of tragedy, a dark, inhospitable expanse that breeds nothing but isolation and ruin. But let 3 hours pass. Let the storm clouds dissolve into the ether, and let the noon sun claim the center of the celestial vault. Suddenly, without a single drop of water being added or removed, the lake transforms into a shimmering mirror of radiant sapphire and translucent turquoise. The dark, predatory fingers vanish, replaced by a million dancing diamonds of pure, brilliant light. The deep floor of the basin, once obscured by the ink-black gloom, becomes hyper-visible, revealing smooth, golden pebbles and vibrant ribbons of emerald aquatic flora swaying in a peaceful, welcoming current. The exact same traveler returning to the exact same shore would now breathe a deep sigh of expansive peace, marveling at the pristine, life-giving beauty of the water, proclaiming it to be a sanctuary of absolute grace and resilience. This meteorological transformation exposes a profound and dizzying psychological paradox. The lake itself did not alter its structure. It did not change its history. It did not shift its location. The radical variation in its nature was entirely dictated by the atmospheric prism through which its depths were viewed. The human mind lives in a state of permanent delusion, believing its memories are like cold, static alpine lakes, frozen repositories of factual data that remain identical regardless of when or how they are visited. They do not realize that the memory they summon is completely at the mercy of the current psychological weather pattern ruling their chest. The past is not an objective record. It is a highly fluid substance that changes its color, its meaning, and its energetic payload. The moment the current internal sky shifts from a storm of fear to a noon of sovereign power. To comprehend the full depth of the human entrapment, one must abandon the comforting belief that revision is a novel, esoteric technique that is only performed during deliberate meditative rituals. The shocking foundational reality of consciousness is that revision is already running continuously, 24 hours a day, below the surface of your awareness without your permission. The mind is not a passive mirror that accurately preserves the data of your life. It is an active, aggressive, and highly biased internal editor that is constantly rewriting, rearranging, and reinterpreting your history in the dark shadows of the subconscious. Let us deploy the clinical method of recursive thinking to peer into this automated editorial room. We must ask the first fundamental question: why does the human mind constantly alter the memories of past events without the conscious permission of the individual? The mind performs this continuous, automated editing because it is bound by an absolute psychological law. The intellect cannot tolerate structural cognitive dissonance. The ego demands a cohesive, unified reality. It cannot allow an individual to occupy a specific internal state today while holding a memory that actively contradicts that state. The present moment is the absolute tyrant of the internal kingdom. It demands that the past bow down and provide a cohesive case to justify the current emotional baseline. How does this automated editing execute itself in the daily life of an individual? It operates through the mechanism of the current emotional state acting as a highly specialized prism or lens. Consider the precise phenomenon of an identical childhood event recalled through two completely different current frequencies. If an individual drops into a state of unworthiness, depression, or lack today, that state acts as an aggressive internal editor. The editor instantly goes to work in the archive room of the brain. It does not pull the whole truth of childhood. It clusters together only the moments of criticism, the cold glances, the instances of isolation. It highlights the rejections, darkens the shadows of the old rooms, and edits out all memories of laughter, strength, or safety. It builds a flawless, airtight legal case of victimization to justify why the individual feels broken right now. Conversely, if that exact same individual experiences a profound awakening, stepping into a state of high creative capability, financial triumph, and sovereign self-worth, and then looks back at the exact same childhood, the permissionless editor instantly rearranges the entire archive. The moments of neglect or difficulty do not vanish, but their structural meaning is completely inverted. The editor shifts them into the background, bringing forward the hidden instances of personal resilience, the moments where the child found internal resourcefulness, and the early sparks of unique talent. The same life story that was read yesterday as a tragic chronicle of defeat is read today as an epic saga of preparation and unique forging. The text of the past did not change. The editor simply changed the lens, forcing the old data to realign itself with the new king of the present state. We must then ask the secondary, deeper question: what is the grave danger of allowing this editorial process to run unconsciously in the shadows? The danger is that most individuals are completely unaware that their current low frequencies are actively poisoning their history, which in turn reinforces their low frequencies, locking them into a catastrophic downward spiral of limitation. When you allow fear, anxiety, or resentment to rule your present hour, you are giving the permissionless editor full authority to rewrite your memories into a deeper narrative of limitation. The editor takes the raw clay of your past and shapes it into an insurmountable wall, screaming that you have always failed, that you have always been rejected, and that you have no structural right to reach for a larger life. You become a captive to a version of history that your own current misery is actively manufacturing in the dark. The only way to break this loop is to step into the projection booth, reclaim the editorial chair, and transition from a passive witness of automated revision to a conscious, deliberate author of your own timeline. In the twilight centuries of the great golden empire of Oakhaven, there lived a sovereign emperor who wished to preserve the definitive history of his reign for the generations to come. The empire had experienced a complex, turbulent destiny, decades of immense wealth, artistic brilliance, and vast territorial conquests, punctuated by periods of brutal famine, devastating plagues, and bitter civil wars. The raw data of the empire's archives was vast, filling a subterranean vault made of cold marble, containing millions of official decrees, battlefield maps, economic ledgers, and personal letters from the peasantry. To compile this massive archive into a singular, cohesive chronicle, the emperor hired two of the most celebrated historians in the known world. The first was Master Eldon, a brilliant scholar who had spent his recent decades living in exile within a cold, damp northern outpost. Eldon was a man consumed by a deep, unresolved bitterness. He had been dismissed by his peers, his personal wealth had been ruined by inflation, and his heart was heavy with a cynical disdain for human nature. He occupied a permanent internal state of resentment, seeing the world as a cruel, chaotic arena where greed and failure were the only true metrics of destiny. The second historian was Master Valerius, a visionary philosopher who lived in the vibrant cultural heart of the capital. Valerius was a man who possessed a profound, unshakable faith in the resilience of the human spirit. He had survived severe personal tragedies, the loss of his family to a historic plague, but he had transmuted that grief into a deep, luminous wisdom. He occupied a permanent state of creative authority, seeing every crisis as a necessary labor pain preceding the birth of a higher order of civilization. Both biographers were given absolute, equal access to the exact same subterranean vault. They sat at identical cedar tables, reading the exact same decrees, analyzing the exact same economic records, and studying the exact same military battles of the previous 50 years. They were commanded to work in absolute isolation, without consulting one another, to produce their separate manuscripts. 2 years passed, and both historians presented their finished works to the emperor in the grand throne room. Master Eldon stepped forward first, laying a heavy black leather volume upon the marble steps. The title was The Chronicle of Decadence, The Inevitable Decay of Oakhaven. The emperor opened the pages and gasped. Eldon had written a horrifying, devastating tragedy. Using the raw data of the archives, Eldon's manuscript focused entirely on the famines, the strategic blunders of the generals, and the corruption of the ancient tax collectors. He had woven the battles into a narrative of meaningless slaughter, portraying the emperor's historic currency reform not as a bold economic salvation, but as an act of desperate tyranny that crushed the poor. Every sentence was dark, cold, and heavy with the scent of doom. Eldon had constructed an airtight, logically flawless case, proving that Oakhaven had always been a broken, fragile, and fundamentally flawed experiment destined for the mud. The emperor looked at the book and felt his heart contract with a sudden, suffocating sense of failure. Then Master Valerius stepped forward, presenting a volume bound in white linen and bordered with gold leaf. The title was The Saga of Resonance, How Oakhaven Forged Its Golden Destiny. The emperor opened the pages, his eyes widening in absolute bewilderment. He was looking at the exact same 50-year history, yet the narrative was entirely unrecognizable. Valerius had taken the exact same famines and portrayed them as the supreme catalysts that forced the empire to invent its legendary agricultural irrigation systems, permanently securing its food supply for centuries. He analyzed the exact same civil wars, demonstrating how the friction had burned away the outdated, feudal structures of the old nobility, allowing a modern, fair legal system to be born across the provinces. The military defeats were framed not as slaughters, but as the critical, necessary lessons that forged the greatest generation of resilient commanders the world had ever seen. The currency reform was written as an epic masterstroke of financial architecture that insulated the nation from external collapses. The book radiated a majestic, unshakable atmosphere of triumph, purpose, and sovereign power. It proved that every crisis had been a deliberate, structural preparation for the empire's ultimate golden age. The emperor looked from Eldon to Valerius, completely astounded. "How is this possible?" he demanded, his voice echoing off the high stone vaults. "You were given the exact same records. You studied the exact same dates, the exact same decrees, and the exact same deaths. Yet one of you has brought me a dungeon of despair, and the other has brought me a palace of gold. Which of these histories is the objective truth?" Master Valerius stepped forward, bowing softly, his eyes reflecting the warm light of the throne room torches. Neither history is the objective truth, Your Majesty, Valerius replied, his voice rich with an ancient, settled certainty. The archive itself is merely a formless heap of dead ink and blank paper. It possesses no voice, no meaning, and no independent reality. Eldon did not write the history of Oakhaven. He wrote the history of his own bitter exile, using your records to build a mirror for his resentment. And I did not write the history of your reign. I wrote the history of my own internal triumph, using the exact same records to build a lighthouse for your future. The past has no author, sire, save for the biographer who sits at the table today. The revelation of the two biographers is the ultimate key required to seize control of your own internal timeline. Your memory is not an objective historian telling you the factual truth of your childhood, your past business ventures, or your broken relationships. Your memory is either Eldon or Valerius, quietly sitting at the table of your subconscious mind, using the formless data of your history to build either a dungeon of limitation or a palace of sovereign power, depending entirely on the state you occupy at this exact second. To embody this truth today, you must implement the practice of the biographer's reclamation. Whenever you find yourself looking back at your history and feeling a wave of regret, shame, or resignation, when your inner Eldon presents an airtight case that your past has permanently crippled your potential, you must immediately strip that narrative of its authority. Interrupt the script. Say to yourself with absolute clinical detachment, "This is not the objective truth of my life. This is merely a bitter manuscript being compiled by my current low frequency. I am leaving Eldon's desk." Take a deep conscious breath, shift your physical posture into the alignment of a sovereign creator, and consciously invite Valerius to take the chair. Look at the exact same past event, the bankruptcy, the divorce, the public humiliation, and aggressively demand a new interpretation from your mind. Force yourself to ask, how was this exact crisis a necessary structural preparation for the master I am choosing to be today? How did this fire burn away the illusions, forge my internal boundaries, and hand me the precise architecture required to build my future empire? As we reclaim the editorial chair from the shadows of the unconscious mind, realizing that we are the active biographers of every hour that has passed, the entire linear illusion of time begins to fracture into pieces. We are no longer the helpless products of a historical cause. We are the active cause of our history's meaning. If this radical exposure of the mind's hidden authorship has broken the spell of your old tragedies, take a brief moment to like this transmission and subscribe to our ongoing work, aligning your journey with our future insights. By consciously controlling the meaning of your past in the present moment, you are performing a continuous act of prophylactic revision. You are refusing to let the shadows of the unconscious edit your destiny into limitation. But daily maintenance requires more than an occasional shift in perspective. To permanently anchor this sovereign authority within the nervous system, one must establish a definitive, unyielding evening protocol, a nightly purge, designed to clean the slate of the mind before the subconscious enters the deep creative reservoirs of. How do we systematically review the hours of each day to erase the micro-traumas, the small insults, and the financial frictions before they harden into permanent traits? What is the literal science of the twilight ritual that transforms tomorrow's canvas? To master the clinical execution of the nightly purge, we must advance to the final operational phase of the blueprint. The grand throne room of the Winter Palace is slowly descending into the profound velvet stillness of midnight. Outside, the great brass gates have been bolted against the darkness, and the standard bearers have retired to their quarters. Within the hall, the intense, chaotic pageantry of the afternoon court session has evaporated into thin air. Gone are the shouting foreign ambassadors, the petulant minor nobles, wrestling for geographic border rights, and the desperate merchants pleading for tax exemptions. The echo of thousands of pacing boots, clinking swords, and frantic arguments has finally dissolved into the high, vaulted stonework of the ceiling. Yet, the floor of the court is not pristine. As the pale moonlight filters through the high stained glass windows, it illuminates a landscape of quiet, messy degradation. The polished white marble is marred by dark, greasy streaks of wet mud dragged in from the outer city streets. A heavy silver goblet has been overturned near the dais, leaving a sticky purple pool of spilled wine that is slowly soaking into the cracks of the stone. The soot from dozens of burning tallow torches has settled across the gilded cornices like a fine, black shroud of ash. If left untouched, this accumulated daily debris would harden by morning into permanent stains, turning a sanctuary of imperial majesty into a dingy, corrupted hall of neglect. Through the shadows enters a solitary, silent figure. She carries no crown, no scepter, and no legal authority to issue decrees. She is the palace cleaner. In her hands, she holds a simple wooden basin filled with pure, distilled almond oil, a collection of soft linen cloths, and a broad cedar broom. She does not wait for a month to pass. She does not allow years of soot to blacken the marble walls until a massive, structural demolition is required to restore the room. With an absolute, meditative rhythm, she goes to work upon the immediate debris of the day. She kneels beside the spilled wine, wiping it away before it can permanently dye the limestone. She passes her oiled cloth over the soot, stained gold, until it reflects the moonlight with unblemished clarity. She sweeps the dried mud out through the western portal into the void. She works in absolute reverent silence, performing a preventative liturgy of purification. By the time the first pink light of dawn strikes the eastern turrets, she has completely vanished. The High Magistrate and the Emperor walk into the chamber to initiate a new session, finding a canvas that is flawless, immaculate, and utterly unburdened by the friction of yesterday. The paradox is magnificent. The lowliest servant in the empire is the one who actively dictates the baseline purity of the throne room, ensuring that the king never has to govern from a seat of accumulated rot. To transition from an occasional practitioner of psychological restructuring to a master whose life is a continuous monument of sovereign freedom, one must establish the twilight ritual, the nightly purge of daily friction. The fundamental error of the spiritual amateur is the belief that revision is a crisis management tool, a desperate emergency measure to be deployed only when a massive trauma occurs, such as a bankruptcy, a divorce, or a catastrophic professional collapse. They allow the small, seemingly insignificant frictions of their daily existence to pass unexamined into the depths of their psyche, believing they are too minor to matter. Let us deploy the method of recursive thinking to expose the immense danger of this daily neglect. We must ask the first clinical question: why do the micro-traumas of a standard day, a dismissive email, a cold interaction, a brief moment of financial anxiety, possess the power to completely derail an individual's future if left unrevised before sleep? The vulnerability exists because of the precise neurological and metaphysical architecture of the human brain right before sleep. As the physical body prepares to enter the state of rest, the beta brainwaves of analytical, defensive waking consciousness begin to collapse. The mind transitions through the alpha and theta states, a unique, highly receptive twilight zone where the gatekeeper of the logical intellect goes offline. During these quiet minutes, the subconscious mind becomes completely porous, open, and utterly undefended. It sits like a vast, unmapped ocean of creative energy, waiting for its final programming instructions before it initiates its nightly labor of manufacturing reality. How does the daily debris process itself if an individual falls asleep without a purge? If you go to bed carrying the unexamined friction of the day, if your final internal review consists of replaying the sting of an abrasive comment from a colleague, ruminating on a minor financial setback, or sighing over your own self-doubt, you are handing that exact script directly to the subconscious worker. The subconscious does not know that the interaction is over. It does not understand that the email was sent hours ago. It treats the memory as an active, current command. Through the long hours of the night, the subconscious takes that dark, contracted script and uses its immense creative power to print it into the baseline blueprint of your identity. It hardens the microtrauma into a permanent personality trait. It weaves the daily friction into tomorrow's reality, ensuring that you wake up the next morning already trapped in the state of the person who was dismissed, forced to navigate a new day using an old, corrupted lens. You are building a mountain of limitation out of the daily dust of your life. We must then ask the secondary, deeper question. How does the execution of a daily evening revision completely neutralize this automated compounding of limitation? The mechanism is an absolute, predictable law of consciousness. By implementing a systematic review of the day before the subconscious threshold is crossed, you are intercepting the freight train before it enters the tunnel. You sit on the edge of your bed as the active editor in the projection booth. You go through the past 12 hours and identify every single moment that caused your chest to contract or your energy to drop. You do not judge the day. You do not engage in self-flagellation or moral grading. You simply treat the unwanted moments as temporary, fluid lines of pencil sketch upon a canvas. Using the power of your current sovereign imagination, you erase the sketch and redraw the lines. You reimagine the abrasive conversation until it becomes an interaction of deep, mutual respect. You rewrite the financial anxiety into a moment of quiet, unshakable stability. You hear the yes where the outer world uttered a no. Because these revised versions are injected precisely at the twilight threshold, the subconscious mind accepts them as the definitive, ultimate truth of what occurred during the day. It takes the golden, revised script into the night, operating from a state of expansion, victory, and peace. It aligns your deep neural pathways with capability, ensuring that you wake up the next morning standing on a clean, unblemished horizon, completely free from the emotional debts of yesterday. In the ancient coastal trade capital of Tyre, there lived a master merchant named Master Kalin. He was a man of legendary fortune, managing a global network of cargo ships that brought silks from the east, ivory from the south, and precious metals from the western islands. His warehouses were the size of palaces, and his name was synonymous with an unshakable, luminous clarity of mind. While other merchants in the exchange were haggard, anxious, and prone to sudden fits of rage or despair, Kalin moved through the chaotic storms of commerce with the serene, easy grace of a philosopher king. The source of his unclouded mastery was a profound, secret ritual that he performed every evening without exception. Every afternoon, the trading floor of Tyre was an arena of brutal, exhausting friction. Kalin was routinely subjected to severe insults from envious rivals. Corrupt port officials attempted to extort his captains. Market panics caused the value of his grain contracts to drop unpredictably, and his own clerks made costly errors that resulted in immediate financial losses. Kalin did not fight these occurrences in the street. He did not shout or lose his composure during the heat of the day. He recorded every transaction, every insult, and every setback in a small, rough leather pocketbook. At the stroke of sunset, Kalin would withdraw from his offices and climb to the top floor of his seaside villa. The room was simple, containing nothing but a low oil lamp, a comfortable linen chair, and his grand official ledger, a massive book bound in white vellum and fitted with gold clasps, known as the Book of the Estate. One chaotic Tuesday, Kalin had endured a particularly devastating series of daily frictions. A major spice ship had been delayed by a storm, causing a rival merchant to publicly mock him on the steps of the exchange, screaming that Kalin's fortunes were sinking into the sea. Later that afternoon, a nervous banking house had abruptly cancelled a short-term credit line, leaving Kalin with an immediate deficit of 10,000 gold pieces. Kalin sat in his twilight chair, the oil lamp casting a warm amber glow across his face. He opened his rough pocketbook and reviewed the scars of the day. He felt his chest tighten ever so slightly as he recalled the sneering face of his rival and the cold words of the banker. He closed his eyes. He did not engage in panic. He took a long, deep breath of the cool sea air, allowing his analytical mind to grow soft and quiet. Then, he opened the Book of the Estate, dipped his quill into rich midnight blue ink, and began to write the permanent record of his day. But he did not write what the physical street had displayed. He began to perform the nightly purge. He went back in his imagination to the steps of the exchange. He saw the crowd gathered, saw his rival step forward, but in the theater of his mind, Kalin changed the script. He did not hear an insult. He imagined his rival reaching out a hand, his face filled with a profound, humbled admiration, saying, "Your resilience in the face of the storm is a lesson to us all, Kalin. Your ships are guaranteed by the gods themselves." Kalin held the scene until he could see the exact texture of his rival's tunic, hear the specific cadence of his respectful voice, and feel his own physical chest expand with a deep, somatic wave of honor and safety. He then moved to the memory of the banking house. He reimagined the meeting with the banker. In his revised script, the banker did not cancel the credit. Instead, he opened a drawer, pushed a massive leather sack of gold across the cedar desk, and declared, "Your credit is the bedrock of this city, Master Kalin. We are doubling your allocation effective immediately." Kalen focused intensely on the heavy, metallic clink of the coin bags within his mind, feeling the profound weight of unshakable financial abundance until his nervous system drenched itself in a deep state of relief and total victory. He wrote these revised events into the book of the estate with beautiful, elegant calligraphy. To any clerk reading the ledger, it appeared that Kalen had experienced a day of absolute, uninterrupted triumph, wealth, and public adulation. When the writing was finished, Kalen closed the grand book, locked the gold clasps, and blew out the oil lamp. He lay his head upon his pillow and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. His subconscious mind, operating through the night from the ultimate script left in the vellum ledger, went to work using the frequency of victory, respect, and infinite supply. The next morning, Kalen walked down to the harbor. As he approached the market, the banker who had canceled his credit line last night rushed across the cobblestones, his face pale and sweating. "Master Kalen!" "Forgive me," the banker stammered, bowing repeatedly. "I spent the night in absolute agony over my decision yesterday. It was a monumental error. I have spoken with my directors, and we have decided not only to restore your credit line, but to expand it by 20,000 gold pieces, without interest. Please, accept our deepest apologies." As Kalen signed the new agreement, he looked up and saw his rival merchant walking past, nodding to him with a quiet, deferential respect that perfectly matched the look from his night's imagination. Kalen smiled softly, his internal ground remaining perfectly settled, calm, and sovereign. He knew that the material street was merely an echo chamber, forced to play the music that he had masterfully composed in his vellum ledger while the rest of the city was asleep. The secret of Master Kalen is the daily operational necessity for every individual who refuses to let their life be dictated by casual circumstance. You must stop carrying the micro-debts of your daily interactions into the sanctuary of your sleep. You must become the silent cleaner of your own internal court, erasing the scuffs, the muddy footprints, and the soot of daily life before they have the chance to harden into permanent destiny. To embody this truth today, you must implement the nightly ledger protocol. Every evening, in the quiet minutes, before your head touches the pillow, when the light is low and your conscious analytical mind is growing soft, perform a systematic review of the day that has passed. Go through the hours from morning to night and locate every single friction point, the email that stung your pride, the cold silence from your spouse, the sudden surge of self-doubt while looking at your bank account. Isolate these frames. Now, execute the purge. Reimagine each scenario exactly as you wished it had unfolded. Run the new film loop with full sensory engagement. Hear the compliments, feel the influx of wealth, see the smiles of your allies. Repeat the revised loop until your physical body relaxes, your chest expands, and the original contraction dissolves into a light, easy wave of completion. Fall asleep directly from that state of expansion, giving your subconscious mind a golden blueprint to construct your tomorrow. As the practice of the nightly purge becomes an unyielding, mechanical habit, as the daily slate is systematically cleaned before the threshold of sleep is crossed, a staggering, monumental realization begins to loom on the horizon of your awareness. For if the past of 5 years ago is merely an act of current imagination, and the past of 5 hours ago can be entirely dissolved through a nightly ritual, then the entire structure of historical causality must fall into ruin. We have been conditioned since childhood to believe that we are the downstream products of our history, that our traumas formed us, our childhoods defined us, and our past limitations are the absolute bedrock of who we are today. But what if this foundational doctrine is the ultimate lie of the human matrix? What if you are not a product of your past at all, because the past itself has no independent existence outside of your current choice to remember it? The time has come to shatter the final wall of the invisible cage. We must step out of the linear timeline entirely and claim the absolute, terrifying freedom of the non-linear self. Let us advance to the grand finale of our architecture. Deep within the damp, forgotten interior of an ancient stone fortress lies a subterranean cell. The chamber is a narrow, windowless cube constructed from heavy blocks of dark volcanic basalt, completely insulated from the seasonal shifts of the earth or the golden warmth of the noon sun. For 40 years, a prisoner has inhabited this small, suffocating space, He is not bound by iron chains. His ankles are free from weights. There are no armed guards pacing outside the heavy oak door. Yet, he has never attempted to step toward the exit. The walls of his cell are lined entirely with thousands of jagged, silvered mirror shards, each one angled with absolute precision to face the center of the room. When the prisoner opens his eyes, he is subjected to an all-encompassing, relentless assault of reflection. Wherever he looks, he does not see empty space. He sees a high-definition catalog of his own historical scars, his moments of deepest public humiliation, and the grotesque, distorted silhouettes of every failure he has ever committed on the streets of the outer city. The shards magnify his wrinkles, amplify his old wounds, and display a terrifying chronicle of a life completely broken by tragedy. He stands in the center of the room, trembling, his hands pressed against his ears, weeping in absolute despair. He looks at the mirrors and declares with a voice broken by decades of grief that he is a permanent captive to the figures staring back at him. He believes the reflections are massive, unyielding granite walls that possess an independent creative authority over his destiny, an absolute, historical given that dooms him to eternal imprisonment. But let a single, transcendent moment of absolute awareness strike his mind. The prisoner, driven to the brink of madness, reaches out his hand to push against an especially terrifying image of an old bankruptcy. His fingertips do not collide with an unyielding mountain of stone. They make contact with a faint, almost invisible seam between two glass fragments. He presses down with the weight of a sovereign living man. Instantly, a sharp, crystalline crack echoes through the chamber. The illusion shatters. The thousands of silvered mirror shards do not hold their position. They cascade downward, tumbling to the stone floor in a harmless, glittering avalanche of dust and sand. As the shards clear, the prisoner gasps in absolute bewilderment. There were never any basalt walls behind the mirrors. There was no stone dungeon enclosing his life. The cell was an optical illusion, constructed entirely from the reflections of his own unexamined history. As the glass dissolves, he looks out onto an endless, radiant horizon of open sky and sun-drenched valleys that had been stretching out before him the entire time, completely untouched by his 40 years of self-induced torment. The paradox is absolute, terrifying, and profoundly liberating. The prison was not made of stone. It was made of the prisoner's own willingness to believe that the mirror possessed a permanent creative power over his soul. To enter the final, supreme sanctuary of human consciousness, one must perform a radical, uncompromising act of philosophical demolition upon the foundational lie of human civilization. The ultimate doctrine handed down by the academies, the psychological institutions, and the collective cultural matrix since childhood is the absolute law of historical causality. Humanity is trained to believe that it is a downstream product, a mechanical consequence of a linear timeline. Society screams that your childhood formed you, your traumas shaped your neural pathways, your past rejections defined your creative limitations, and your history is the absolute, unalterable bedrock from which all present identity must be understood. Let us deploy the sharpest scalpel of recursive thinking to completely dismantle this existential prison. We must ask the supreme, definitive question: why does the past appear to possess a permanent, causal power over the present and future of a human life if it has no physical existence? The past appears to possess causal power for one reason, and one reason only, because the individual is actively and continuously performing a creative act of remembrance in this immediate microsecond, using their own divine life force to reanimate a corpse. Historical causality is a total psychological fiction. The event that occurred 10 years ago has no mouth to speak, no hand to strike, and no energy to limit a living human being today. When you say, "I cannot succeed today because I failed in 2018, you are misinterpreting the direction of the creative current. The year 2018 is not reaching forward through time to crush your 2026 enterprise. Rather, you are reaching backward into an empty void, extracting a dead blueprint of failure, bringing it into this present moment, and using the supreme, creative machinery of your current imagination to manufacture a state of limitation. You are the one driving the knife into your own chest, while loudly blaming the person who forged the blade a decade ago. We must then ask the secondary, ultimate question of the master architecture. How does the total realization of this non-linear reality grant an individual absolute emancipation from their history? The liberation occurs the moment the intellect admits the ultimate metaphysical law established across this chronicle. The past does not exist anywhere except as an imaginative act occurring now. Think of what this truly means. It means that you are completely free from everything that has ever happened to you. It means that the rejections, the losses, the childhood abandonments, the years of scarcity, and the wounds that were real and painful do not possess a single ounce of independent, permanent creative power over your future. They are not anchors dropped into solid rock. They are phantoms hanging in an abyss, completely dependent on your current permission to cast a shadow across your path. If your history is nothing more than a current act of imagination, then your history is fully malleable. It possesses no structural defense against the intervention of your current choice. You do not need to spend decades in therapy analyzing the architecture of your prison. You do not need to perform exhausting, multi-year rituals of self-forgiveness to heal the old self. You simply have to stop creating the prison, reclaim the editorial chair, step into the archive room of your soul, and realize that you have the absolute, sovereign right to perform a total, retroactive clearance of the canvas. You can deliberately choose to remember success where you have been remembering failure. You can remember acceptance where you have been remembering rejection. You can remember belonging where you have been remembering exile. You do not do this to engage in historical revisionism within the physical books of the state. You do it because the state of consciousness generated by the memory is the only thing that has ever actually dictated the mirror of your reality. By changing the act of remembrance, you change the current frequency. By changing the frequency, you force the entire material universe to realign its structure to match the new king of the present hour. You are not a product of your past. You are the permanent author of the meaning of your past, and that authorship is absolute, immediate, and entirely your own. In the ancient, misty highlands of the Western Reach, there lived a broken, ragged beggar named David. He spent his days sitting in the dirt outside the iron gates of a massive, prosperous city-state, his hand extended to beg for copper coins from the passing merchants. His back was permanently stooped, his body was covered in scars from ancient lashings, and his mind was a dark, suffocating archive of absolute defeat. David had been told since his youth a terrible story of his origin. A powerful, cynical court wizard had informed him that he was the son of an executed traitor, a low-born thief who had betrayed the realm, brought a catastrophic plague upon the people, and died screaming in the public square. The wizard had carved this lineage into a heavy lead medallion that hung around David's neck, telling him that the blood of a failure ran through his veins, that his scars were the permanent mark of his biological destiny, and that he was structurally doomed to live and die in the mud as penance for his history. For 40 years, David inhabited this identity with absolute realism, his body and mind contracting into the perfect shape of a certified slave. One winter evening, as a freezing sleet began to fall over the cliffs, David crept into the ruins of an ancient abandoned royal amphitheater to seek shelter from the storm. He lay down upon the cold stone steps, his body shivering, his heart heavy with the familiar, crushing weight of his unworthiness. As the midnight hour approached, the air within the amphitheater suddenly went completely still. The freezing sleet stopped midair, suspended in the ether like diamonds of ice. From the center of the ruined stage emerged a majestic, invisible presence, a figure radiating a light so intense that it turned the darkness into a bright, golden afternoon. It was the Sovereign Watcher, the timeless guardian of the realm's true history. The Watcher did not look at David with pity. He looked at him with the cold, unyielding authority of absolute truth. He pointed a long, luminous staff directly at the lead medallion around the beggar's neck. "Why do you wear the script of a lie, David?" the Watcher demanded, his voice echoing through the stone vaults like a thunderclap. "Why do you allow a dead wizard's ink to dictate the stride of a living king?" "It is my history," David wept, pressing his face into the dirt. The wizard spoke the truth. "My father was a thief. My lineage is rotted. My scars are the proof of what happened to me. I am a product of my past." The wizard did not speak the truth, the Watcher replied, his staff glowing with a blinding white light. The wizard wrote a tragedy to keep your crown in his vault. Your father was not a thief. Your father was King Valerius the Great, the ultimate, unblemished warrior king who defended this province from the shadow empires, who built the very iron gates you beg outside of, and who died in a blaze of absolute glory, leaving a legacy of infinite wealth and sovereign power to his bloodline. David blinked, his mind fracturing against the wall of his old story. But the medals, the records, my memories say otherwise. I remember the courtroom, I remember the whip. Your memories are an illusion manufactured by your willingness to accept a slave's posture, the watcher declared. Look into the mirror of the sky, David. Reclaim your true inheritance. You are not changing what occurred. You are reclaiming the factual truth of your origin, which your current misery has blocked from your sight. The watcher touched the lead medallion with the tip of his staff. Instantly, the heavy gray metal dissolved into smoke, revealing a hidden, magnificent amulet of pure, heavy gold beneath, carved with the imperial crest of the lion. A sudden, violent revolution detonated within David's consciousness. He stopped running from his history. He stopped analyzing his wounds. He took a deep, sovereign breath of the golden air and deliberately chose to remember the truth. He closed his eyes and forced his mind to slide out of the old script. He went back to his childhood, but he no longer saw a slave's hovel. In the theater of his mind, he remembered walking through the grand sunlit corridors of the Winter Palace, his hand held by a tall, majestic father who wore a crown of gold. He heard the deep, loving voice of the king telling him that he was born to rule the stars. He felt the weight of fine royal silks upon his shoulders, and he allowed his physical chest to expand with the immense, unshakable wave of natural dignity, absolute authority, and unblemished worth that belonged to a prince of the realm. As David held that revised memory, as he drenched his nervous system in the chemical payload of his true sovereign lineage, a profound physical transformation rippled through his body. His stooped spine instantly straightened, his shoulders broadened, his skin cleared of its gray pallor, and the scars of the lashings vanished from his flesh, replacing themselves with the smooth, unblemished skin of a warrior who had never known a master. The next morning, as the sun rose over the mountains, David walked toward the iron gates of the city. He was no longer crawling in the dirt. He was no longer extending a hesitant hand for copper coins. He walked with the long, majestic stride of a sovereign ruler returning to his seat of power. The guards at the gate, who had seen him begging for 40 years, did not see a beggar. They looked at his posture, saw the unblemished authority radiating from his eyes, and instinctively dropped to their knees, lowering their spears to the ground in absolute reverence. The citizens rushed forward, shouting his name, their faces filled with a profound, instinctive recognition of his true lineage. David stepped into the throne room completely settled, light, and unshakable, knowing that the entire empire was merely bowing to the baseline reality of the history he had boldly claimed in the silence of his own imagination. The awakening of the non-linear king is the ultimate, definitive summons to every individual who has ever allowed their life to be trimmed, managed, or crippled by the charts of their history. You are not a beggar born to die in the mud of your past rejections, your childhood abandonments, or your corporate collapses. You are the sovereign ruler of your own consciousness, currently sitting at the drafting table of reality, possessing the absolute, immediate authority to rip up the slave's parchment and write a decree of absolute victory across your timeline. To embody this supreme truth tonight, you must perform the sovereign release protocol. As you prepare to close your eyes for sleep, turn away from the external world with the absolute clinical detachment of a master alchemist. Find that one final stubborn memory that has been acting as your private lead medallion, the historical event that still causes your chest to contract, the old ghost that tells you that you are fundamentally broken or limited. Isolate the specimen. Force your intellect to admit that it has no physical coordinate in your room tonight. Now, execute the ultimate revision. Do not edit it lazily. Do not reframe it with weak intellectual rationalizations. Revise it boldly, faithfully, and without compromise. If you were exile, remember belonging. If you were rejected, remember the absolute embrace of acceptance. If you failed, remember the glorious, unshakable impact of your success. splicing the new frames into the real with such intense sensory high definition that your physical body is forced to relax, your lungs fill with current sovereign air, and your baseline energy shifts from survival to total victory. Fall asleep completely drenched in that state, letting your subconscious mind accept the revised script as the permanent, unalterable blueprint of your reality. As the night closes its curtains around the theater of your mind, and you fall into the deep reservoirs of rest, you do so no longer as a victim of a linear timeline, but as the supreme author of your own existence. If these 10 strategic architectures of consciousness have handed you the keys to your invisible prisons, take a final moment to like this transmission and subscribe to our ongoing work, aligning your journey with our future insights. The manual is complete. The blueprints have been laid bare. The geography of yesterday has been permanently dismantled. You stand on the edge of an infinite, unblemished canvas, completely free from the emotional debts of history. Go forward onto the open ocean of your potential. Revise boldly, revise faithfully, and revise until the past you carry is the past that creates the future you choose. Good evening, my friends. I will see you again in the next video.